Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you on behalf of the Atlantic Council today to this conference that we're partnering with the Lithuanian Ministry of Defense on. I want to thank all of you for being here, and I want to thank Defense News in particular for partnering with us today. I'm Damon Wilson, Executive Vice President here at the Atlantic Council, and it's my pleasure to help us open this conference on raising the curtain on the 2018 NATO Brussels Summit. This is our curtain raiser for the summit 1 month from now in Brussels. And we're delighted to have so many distinguished guests and speakers with us today. We're particularly pleased to welcome Minister Raimundas Karoblis with us from the National Defense of Lithuania. And to all of our speakers, thank you for giving us your time and participating today. I want to give special thanks to you, Mr. Minister, and your team, our partners at the ministry who have been supporting and working with our Scowcroft Center team throughout this process on this important dialogue. It's a pleasure working with you. And a big thanks goes out to our media partner, Defense News, as well for today. So we're here in Washington 1 month ahead of the July NATO summit, and there's a lot for us to talk about today, from burden sharing to strengthening collective defense and deterrence in Northern Europe, U.S. leadership in the alliance, proposals on the table for improving capabilities, readiness, mobility, decision-making, the way forward on NATO's southern flank and what the alliance must do to address terrorism, hybrid threats, capacity building in the region, the Iraq mission. But there are also bigger issues at play. You just opened the papers from last week, U.S. tariffs on the EU and Canada. There are concerns regarding unity after the wake of the G7 summit in Quebec. Implications from the Singapore summit and what that means for force posture and implications for our NATO alliance. To, of course, the ever-evolving security and threat perception and what that means vis-a-vis perceptions of Russia's intentions in this neighborhood as well. And all of this is against the backdrop of one of the most important factors in the alliance of how to actually project and strengthen and deepen a sense of alliance unity with these issues on the table. So we're honored to have several senior officials, military leaders, top experts, business executives, media from across the community here to talk about these issues. So with that, I'm going to turn over to two folks to help set the scene for the conversation. First, we're going to turn to Minister Karoblis. We're delighted to welcome you here. Having served his country since 1994 when he first joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he's been a strong voice for European security, having more recently served as Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs and prior to that as Lithuania's permanent representative to the European Union. Thank you for your strong voice on defense issues within the alliance. We're looking forward to your perspective to kick this off. But before turning it over to the minister, I want to encourage everybody to join this conversation and expand it with our online community that's joined us and watching us by using the hashtag NATO Summit and AC us online at AC Scowcroft as well. Excuse me for that. So once again, thanks to all of you for being here. We'll turn to the minister first, and then I'll introduce our next scene setter, Tom Goffus from the Pentagon. Please, Mr. Minister. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to be together with all of you today and discuss the upcoming NATO summit, which will take place only a few weeks from now in Brussels. Let me start by thanking the organizers from the Atlantic Council for bringing us together. This is a very timely discussion. As you know, the preparations for the NATO summit are entering their final stage. Last week I was in Brussels together with Secretary Mattis and our fellow NATO defense ministers. It was the last NATO ministerial event before the summit, at least official event before NATO summit. Though the final summit declaration and some other documents are yet to be agreed, it's pretty clear by now that our heads of state will and will not decide at the Brussels summit. Well, many things can still go wrong between today and the summit. We have this situation. In my opening remarks today, I would like to offer you the Lithuanian perspective at the state of the alliance, key challenges in the run-up to the summit, and highlight the areas where NATO will have to focus its efforts in the near and medium term. I also very much look forward to hearing from Thomas Goffus and other speakers from the US administration about their expectations from the summit. As far as the Baltic states are concerned, the US commitment and leadership are of paramount importance for NATO's credible posture in the Baltic region. What would make the NATO summit a success from Lithuanian perspective? Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, the summit has to reaffirm as loudly as possible the measure of transatlantic solidarity. This solidarity has been the very foundation of the alliance since the establishment of NATO 70 years ago. Nowadays, unfortunately, it can no longer be taken as granted. Today, the transatlantic political agenda is increasingly beset by disagreements and public recriminations. We all should be deeply concerned by these developments and by their potential repercussions on the Atlantic unity. There is no need to explain here as to who would benefit most from a deepening rift between the United States and Europe. We should not let it happen. Therefore, the outcome of the NATO summit will be determined not only by the texts of our diplomats will end up agreeing on, or think our leaders are going to say behind the closed doors in the summit. Its success will first and foremost be judged by the public messaging coming from our leaders. The recent G7 meeting offers the scenario we should all seek to avoid. Let's use the remaining time until the summit to make sure that the vital transatlantic link remains undisturbed by disagreements, no matter how big and complex they may appear in other policy areas. The unique ability of the United States to foster and lead alliances around the world is something what makes your country truly great. The aspiring world powers like China and Russia may catch up with the US in specific areas of military technological development or operational know-how, but only the United States has the ability today to bring together dozens of nations to a battlefield, be it in the fight against terrorism or in defense of freedoms and democracy. Should your country lose this capacity, the world will become a much more dangerous place. This is why it is so important for the summit to send this message of unwavering transatlantic unity. The second important group of deliverables of the upcoming NATO summit is related to the so-called southern flank of the alliance. The past two NATO summits in Warsaw and Wales took place in the wave of Russia's annexation of Crimea and aggression against Ukraine. Therefore, the agenda of these summits was naturally titled in the eastern directions. This will not be the case at the Brussels Summit. The countries in the southern Europe are indeed facing a host of complex security threats and challenges. Therefore, it is of paramount importance that NATO's adaptation takes due account of their security concerns also. This is another area where NATO nations have to show their solidarity. With this in mind, Lithuania will be increasing of its participation in allied structures and ongoing operations in the south. And finally, the upcoming NATO summit has to take forward the work which the alliance has started at the Wales and Warsaw summits, securing NATO eastern flank. Lately, the progress in some of the critical stands of the work has been slow, and many key decisions have been postponed until after the summit. In Wales and Warsaw, NATO has launched important quick impact measures in response to the Russian aggression in Ukraine. NATO air policing mission has been reinforced, and NATO's EFE battle groups deployed within a very short period of time. This is something we in the Baltic states cordially welcome and are really grateful for that. At the same time, the tasking from Warsaw related to the enablement of the EFE battle groups and work on reinforcements have been put on hold. Unfortunately, the Baltic states are bound by their geography and history to remain the most vulnerable part of the alliance for many years to come. NATO will inevitably have to address a number of inconvenient truths when calibrating its military posture in the Baltic region. Procrastination, it's not an option. Indeed, based on what we have seen in the latest Zapad exercises, NATO should accelerate its planning efforts. As a contribution to our today's discussions on the upcoming NATO summit, I would like to highlight some of our key concerns. Firstly, our intelligence estimates that today Russia is capable of deploying to the Baltics over 50 battalion groups within a week. If I'm not mistaken, 54. NATO's level of ambition, which will be adopted at the summit as a readiness initiative, which is 4 times 30, calls for 30 battle groups to be ready within 30 days. We strongly support this initiative and thank the US for taking the lead. However, an inconvenient truth is that NATO forces may still end by being too little, too late for the defense of Baltic countries. Secondly, at the Warsaw Summit, our heads of state have tasked the alliance to expedite work on reinforcement. Given the unfavorable balance of forces in our region, this is indeed a critical issue for the Baltic countries. Unfortunately, there has been precious little progress in this area. In the meantime, Russia has been bolstering its A2 AD capabilities in Kaliningrad by deploying nuclear-capable Iskander missiles and strengthening also other A2 AD capabilities. Thirdly, NATO needs to adjust its command structure to the new security realities. We firmly believe that a standing land component command has to be established in our region to complement the current NATO's C2 architecture. Given the nature of the threat, NATO also has to simplify its decision-making procedures and delegate more authority to secure. Last but not least, their defense remains as the major vulnerability in the Baltic region, which further complicates the arrival of reinforcements to the Baltic countries. Earlier this year, the Atlantic Council has produced a comprehensive study on their defense in the Baltics, involving into this work some of the top air defense experts. Happy to see one of them, General Gorenc, among the panelists. Eventually, NATO will have to come up with the collective solution to plug air defense gaps in the alliance periphery. Until then, the United States will be the most capable ally to assist the efforts of the Baltic countries in this area. In conclusion, the issues I have raised here are inheritedly complex. There are no simple solutions when one has to deal with the short notice threat emanating from a superior opponent. While military logic may speak in favor of deploying additional forces to the Baltic or prepositioning military equipment, this may turn out to be politically difficult. However, the complexity of the challenges ahead should not deter the alliance from seriously working towards their resolution. I am sure that all those who came here today will spare no effort while looking for the answers. On this optimistic note, I would like to thank once again the organizers and to wish everybody most productive deliberations. Also, I look forward to meeting you again after the summit. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Minister Kirov. Really delighted to have your opening remarks. Now it's really my distinct pleasure to welcome to the stage Tom Goffus, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO at the U.S. Department of Defense. Tom is someone who brings together military experience with policy experience, with the first seat in front of the politics of all of this as well, into his current position. He also happens to be a great friend and a great friend of the Atlantic Council, so we're delighted to have you here. A retired lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy, Tom served in uniform until 2009. He served as a military advisor at the State Department, after which he became a director of strategic and Eastern European affairs at the National Security Council. While in that role, Tom had some experience with NATO summits, having helped work to execute the 2012 NATO summit in Chicago. He's been involved with these issues intimately, from missile defense to Baltic air policing in this region. And he's also played, after that, a key role in Congress, having served with the Senate Armed Services Committee staff, working many of these issues. So this is not his first rodeo at this for a summit. After Tom's remarks, I'm going to invite Magnus Nordeman, our Director of Transatlantic Security Initiative, to join Tom for a moderated conversation after his remarks. But with that, let me welcome you to the stage. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Damon. Sometimes I think I only come here just to hear him give the introduction and feel good about myself for the rest of the week. Thank you very much, Damon. It's great to be here. Minister Kirov, as always, on the leading edge of defense issues, both rhetorically and geographically. We appreciate your insights. We value them, and they help guide us on our way forward. Thank you to the Atlantic Council and to the Lithuanian Ministry of Defense for hosting this event and inviting me to provide some remarks. I'm honored to be here, especially during the 100th anniversary year of Baltic independence. As some of you know, I just returned from the NATO Defense Ministerial, which we think went very well, where we focused on advancing our shared agenda for the NATO summit and setting expectations for the deliverables that we hope will be agreed. We re-emphasized the United States' commitment to the security of Europe and the importance of projecting unity and stability in the face of emerging security challenges that are constantly testing the resilience of our alliance. We see each defense ministerial and the summit as an opportunity to remind allies and partners of the value we place on our relationships and take concrete steps to strengthen those relationships. As you know, one of the Secretary of Defense's favorite lessons learned from history, and he's a student of history, is that nations with allies thrive, nations without allies wither. And that is exactly why strengthening partnerships and alliances is a central pillar of the national defense strategy. Built into that strategy is the commitment to defend allies from military aggression and to bolster our partners against coercion while sharing responsibilities for common defense. That speaks directly to NATO's collective defense role. As Secretary Mattis often says of the United States' commitment to Europe, our actions speak for themselves. The Defense Department has requested this year again $6.5 billion for the European Deterrence Initiative. That is $6.5 billion above our base budget. EDI requests have shown consistent growth since fiscal year 15 and now total over $16 billion in total for EDI. EDI, along with increased presence, more robust exercises, and pre-positioning of equipment that it funds, reaffirms America's commitment to the security and territorial commitment of NATO member states and enhances activities in Eastern Europe to deter Russian aggression. I know that a lot of folks are here today, and what we do here in Washington is look for the right words. What we look for are the right actions, and EDI is one of the right actions. We must also remain committed to NATO's enhanced forward presence in Europe's east and tailored forward presence in the southeast. The EFP battle groups demonstrate Allied solidarity and send a clear message to Russia not to test the alliance. America leads the EFP battle group in Poland, and we provide officers to all NATO force integration units. We also provide troops to the multinational corps Northeast and the multinational division both in the Northeast and in the Southeast. We are working diligently to operationalize the EFP battle groups, including, for example, integrating them with host nation infrastructure, developing appropriate command and control linkages, and ensuring the battle groups can move rapidly when needed. These EFP battle groups must be coherent with the TFP efforts in the South. We share the same strategic message all the way across the frontline states. This year's summit convenes in a security climate in which the United States and Europe face dynamic, volatile threats from a revanchist Russia to radical terrorism to criminal cyber activity. Challenges posed by revisionist powers, particularly Vladimir Putin's Russia, have eroded transparency and predictability in Europe and beyond. Authoritarian actions have disrupted the international stability that we've grown accustomed to, and NATO must be prepared to address them together. As U.S. National Intelligence Director Daniel Coats testified in his opening statement to the U.S. Congress, the risk of interstate conflict, including among great powers, is higher than at any time since the end of the Cold War. We don't want interstate conflict. We don't invite interstate conflict. And the best way to prevent it is to be prepared. The United States agenda for this year's summit includes 3 overarching U.S. government priorities and 4 supporting efforts from the Department of Defense, or initiatives. First, burden sharing. Burden sharing is not an American initiative. Burden sharing is an alliance pledge. These are commitments that we've made to each other. And others are going to judge the credibility of our alliance and the viability of our solidarity on the fulfillment of those commitments. 2014 was a watershed year in NATO. Only 3 nations were spending 2% of GDP on defense at that time. But by 2017, all allies had reversed a downward trend that we feared was threatening NATO's ability to respond to the crises that were building up and trying to deter and defend against. Today, this year, 8 nations are meeting the 2% pledge benchmark, and we applaud the now 16 nations that have reached or have plans to spend 2% of GDP on defense and 20% of defense on capabilities by 2024. We also commend allies for their contributions in other forms, namely the troops and leadership they provide to support NATO missions in Kosovo, Afghanistan, and in the forward presence missions. Second, making NATO more relevant to the fight against terrorism. Non-state actors are utilizing increasingly sophisticated capabilities and remain as a persistent threat driven by ideology and unstable political and economic structures. In the global fight against ISIS, we will be unrelenting in our effort, along with like-minded nations, to crush the physical caliphate and prevent a resurgence. We encourage greater progress on NATO's missions in Iraq and in the Hub for the South, to which the United States will contribute personnel, as well as Afghanistan and those that support our collective mission to defeat ISIS. At the NATO summit, we anticipate allies will reinforce their commitments to these efforts with tangible contributions. Lastly, strengthening deterrence and defense. That is of particular importance for Secretary Mattis, who is charting 4 initiatives to ensure that NATO is fit for our times. The first one, speed of decision-making in a crisis, where we want to ensure that allied political leaders can make decisions at the speed of relevance. Second, NATO command structure adaptation, where we need final agreement on implementing the plans we have charted based on the rigorous analysis and advice of our military authorities. Third, military mobility, where we need robust follow-through in both NATO and in the EU on SACEUR's AOR enablement tasks, plus strong cooperation between our organizations in order to, within the EU, figure out how to advance regulatory reform and infrastructure funding that also reflect NATO's requirements and standards. Finally, on readiness, we are keen to advance the 430s, as the Minister talked about, following the tasking presented in the Council to foster a culture of readiness in NATO. We need to bring a culture of readiness back. It's something that we're fighting not only here in the United States to bring back our readiness, but also in Europe. It is a symptom of underinvestment in our defense capabilities. As DASD for Europe NATO, my top priority, as given to me by the Secretary, is NATO unity and is managing and strengthening bilateral partnerships. This is an enduring task that, based on Secretary Maas' direction, I ensure is considered in all contexts. The Secretary urges the maintenance of a quote-unquote foundation of mutual respect, responsibility, and priorities. And he likes to often say that the country with the most aircraft carriers is not always the country with the best ideas. In that regard, his mission is to maximize our opportunities and tools to consult and plan with allies. No doubt, there will be some areas where allied opinions diverge. That said, NATO has, through nearly 70 years of history, always pulled together to find consensus and succeed. Most recently, the response by nearly 24 countries following the attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal. That was an effective precedent to send a strong signal to Russia, and a prime example of how the United States, with all of its NATO partners, in the NATO context, can show unity and solidarity in the face of unprecedented threats. In the face of aggressive nations seeking to foster division in our alliance, we must stand up for our sovereignty, our security, and, very importantly, our shared values. The unity of the alliance, as I said, and the credibility of our deterrence will be judged by our fulfillment of the commitments we've made to each other, including Wales, that we have accomplished in the future. We're seeing progress, and we know that more needs to be done. Defending our interests necessitates collective adherence to the Wales Pledge and to our other commitments to readiness and mobility, and should be built upon a foundation of respect and unity. So again, thank you for having me here. I very much appreciate it. I appreciate a crowd like this that's interested, deeply interested in these topics. So I'll end there so we can move to some questions.
Tom, thank you so much for those remarks and sharing the U.S. agenda ahead of the summit for us. We have a few minutes for Q&A before we move to our panel, but you certainly already put a lot on the table. Burden sharing, NATO's role in CT, a range of the defense and deterrence initiatives. So there's plenty to talk about. So just 3 rules for the road. I will turn to the audience for a couple of questions. One, state your name and affiliation. Wait for the mic, and perhaps most importantly, make sure that you do indeed have a question for Tom. But let me start with one question. So obviously, burden sharing is central here, and something that we discussed quite a bit over the last 18 months, and certainly in the years before that. A common critique is that it really measures inputs and not outputs, both the 2% and the 20%, and that's important because it measures burden, of course. But do you see opportunities to more formally perhaps complement the 2 and 20 with other measurements for contributions to alliance security?
Yeah, I think that the question comes up a lot, and obviously 2 and 20% is necessary but not sufficient. While we and the standard refrain is cash, contributions, and capabilities, so it goes across all 3 of those. The way we see it, albeit inputs, without those inputs, the contributions are very difficult to, 1, give, and 2, to sustain, especially when we're looking at trying to deter a major power such as Russia. And so with that in mind, we do look at what the contributions are. The Secretary always asks, regardless of which bilat we're doing, what are their contributions to Afghanistan, to OIR, to Kosovo, to other NATO missions, like one of the key pieces right now is the hub in the south. And the United States, as I said, is contributing personnel, and we're looking for others to do that. So the emphasis on the cash and contributions and capabilities is the word "and" between all of those. It's not "or," it's "and." And it's tough to measure because it comes in so many apples and oranges. So what I would tell you is, yes, there are some efforts to do that. Will it be as easy to measure as 2% and 20% that are numbers? No. Is it appreciated and tracked? Yes.
All right, let's go to the audience here. How about we start on the flank over there?
Thank you, gentlemen. Andrew from Defense News. And I just wanted to ask, we heard from the defense minister that the Baltics consider themselves the most vulnerable members of the alliance. Obviously, some members of the alliance will consider themselves of different degrees of at threat or at risk. How does the U.S. manage their relations with each member of the alliance if each member of the alliance has different perceptions on the gravity of the threat or what actually threatens them?
Good question. So this is the variation of threat perception and how that impacts the alliance. The alliance has been dealing with this for 70 years. Where you stand is based in part on where you sit. I think that what we heard at the Defense Ministerial last week is agreement on Russia as a threat, agreement on terrorism as a threat, and this is embodied probably in the 360-degree approach, which means that NATO can't focus on a single threat. The threat environment, as we see, is proliferating. We manage that by attempting to see what within NATO applies to each of those countries. Along the southern part of, along the southern flank of NATO, in Portugal, Spain, and Italy, obviously in Greece there's a focus on the south. Thus we have a framework for the south. On the east we have EFP and TFP. Overall, we need to be prepared for a large potential conflict with Russia. So all of these things go into what we're trying to get accomplished, including what we're doing, what NATO is doing in Iraq, and what it's attempting to do in the Mediterranean and in other locations. So I think that there are different threat perceptions. That is part of the art, and frankly the grace of NATO is the ability to try and handle all of those and prioritize at the same time.
And on this flank over here.
Robert Friedman, Johns Hopkins University. In light of what happened at the G7, and what appears to be a very clear conflict between the United States on the one hand and its European allies on the other, how does this impact what NATO is doing? Can you separate out the principles on the one hand and the defense ministers on the other? How are you going to handle that?
You know, maybe you save part of that for the subsequent panel, and Dr. Hooker can take a swing at that one. That's why he gets paid the big bucks. Here's how I would start this conversation at the Defense Ministerial last week. There's a lot of stressors on the transatlantic bond. There have been in the past. And as I said in my remarks, throughout nearly 70 years, we found a way to make it work. At the Defense Ministerial, what was evident was that we were focused intently on the mission of security of the people of the nations of NATO. And that focus kept us pretty much in the defense lane the entire time. What we didn't hear about were a lot of the stressors. What we heard about was the need for NATO unity. And so what I would tell you was, in the management of that, Secretary Mattis was so focused on security. The other ministers were also focused on security, that we were in that lane and we made great progress along those lines. The emphasis was on solidarity, unity, and common values. And that carried us through the Defense Ministerial, which obviously occurred before the G7. So that's an emerging issue that we're still, obviously, will be a data point as we go into the summit in July. So I don't give you a great answer for that. It's a bit outside of my lane.
So now we're taking care of the flank. So let's go down the middle here. The lady on the aisle here.
Thank you. I'm Nana Sajaya from the Voice of America Georgian Service. The Wales Summit and the Warsaw Summit have been mentioned. Minister mentioned them twice. And you also spoke about the commitments the alliance has made. How about the 2008 Bucharest Summit and its commitments made to Georgia and Ukraine?
Yeah, the Bucharest commitment remains. The commitment to open door remains. I think as we're seeing, we're hoping for good things. There are some good stories coming out on Macedonia. I know specifically you're asking about Georgia and Ukraine. We're attempting to put together, a format item where we can talk through some of those issues. The alliance still remains focused on Ukraine and Georgia and what we're going to do to try and move those initiatives forward. Beyond that, we'll see what the future holds. I wouldn't want to speculate beyond that for right now. But what I will tell you is that the alliance is seized of the matter, and it comes up in the Defense Ministerial as a topic that we need to wrestle with.
I think we have time for one final question. Right there in the middle, Valerie.
Hi, Valerie Insina with Defense News. Turkey is slated to get its first F-35 next week, and some in Congress have been trying to prevent this due to Turkey's impending purchase of the Russian S-400 air defense system. Has the U.S. solidified what its approach on this issue is going to be, whether there's going to be any restrictions on the delivery or how Turkey uses the system? And when you go to the summit, will you have a message for Turkey about this issue?
It's a great question. I think taking the last part first, is there a message for Turkey? The answer is that we don't think that the purchase of the S-400 is helpful. We think that it presents technical risks, and that we have a process to evaluate the risks to Western technology that would present. Our preference is that they do not acquire the S-400. Given that, they are a sovereign nation, and they are trying to take care of their defense needs. What restrictions are placed on them and what Congress will eventually pass, I can't even speculate on at this point. What I would say is that we made progress through the agreement of the Manbij roadmap, and we're working to implement that roadmap while we continue the fight against ISIS. And we need to ensure the destruction of the physical caliphate. So we're making some progress in our Turkey relationship. We're also making progress against ISIS. We're trying to continue down that path. And again, our preference would be that Turkey not acquire the S-400.
So with that, I think that's all the time we have, unfortunately, and we need to get to our next panel. But Tom, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. I know you're a busy guy. We're 4 weeks out, and we do appreciate all the hard work you're putting into it, and good luck in 4 weeks. So how about a round of applause? Now I'm going to ask Aaron Mehta, our moderator for our first panel on defense and deterrence, to seize the stage and bring his panelists with us.
They've assigned it already. All right, well, hello, everyone. My name is Aaron Mehta. I am Deputy Editor and Senior Pentagon Correspondent for Defense News. On behalf of Defense News, we'd like to thank the Council for partnering with us on this. It's a great event. We're really excited, as you can tell from the number of staffers that we have asking questions here, to be part of this. And if you have visited Defense News today, defensenews.com, you'll see we have a whole landing page for NATO-related topics. We're going to be updating that throughout the month leading up to the summit, so we encourage everyone to go check that out. And I'm personally very excited to be here with this particular group of individuals who are incredibly talented and well-known in the issues of NATO and the realm. On behalf of the Atlantic Council, who has asked me to try to keep this short so that we can get to questions, make sure we stay on time, I'm going to give very brief bios for the three of them, and then they're going to give short comments. We're hoping 3 to 5 minutes. We'll see how that goes. And then we're going to enter into questions. So to my left, Richard Hooker is Special Advisor to the President and Senior Director for Europe and Russia on the National Security Council. As you heard, he may have some thoughts to share about the G7 and what happened last week, or not.
Or maybe not.
To his left is retired General Frank Gorentz. General Gorentz is former commander of U.S. Air Forces in Europe and Africa and NATO Allied Air Command. And I can say, having dealt with General Gorentz in my previous life covering the Air Force, one of the better interviews in the military at the time. So excited to have him up here. And then Jonathan Vasilyov is the permanent secretary from the Ministry of Defense in Estonia. And that means he is essentially responsible for policy resourcing and investment planning. So if you want to know what the Estonians are planning on doing with their money, the 2% they're hitting, he's the guy to talk to us. So without further ado, Richard, if you want to take it first.
Okay, thanks a lot. I've got about 5 minutes here. You know, whenever anyone introduces you as incredibly talented, it always makes me look around and wonder who the hell they're talking about. 'Cause it's not me, but yeah, a couple of remarks as we head up into the summit. First, I'd just like to state up front that determining the right alliance, deterrence, and defense posture first requires us to define what the problem at hand might be. And we think it's to ask ourselves how to deter a potential threat to ensure that an attack on NATO territory ever occurs. So we don't think in terms of, how do we cope with it, but more on how do we deter that. Very important. We think we've made good progress on enhancing our deterrence and defense posture since 2014. So some examples are NATO's enhanced forward presence units in each of the Baltic states and Poland, the U.S. assurance measures through Operation Atlantic Resolve, and the increasing U.S. force presence in Europe. I mean, it's modest, but it's definite. Funded largely through our European Deterrence Initiative, to name only a few. But we can't be complacent. We understand there's more work to be done. As we said in our national security strategy, we agree that NATO's eastern flank needs to be strengthened, and we're looking at ways to help catalyze our frontline allies to better defend themselves. Looking at the Baltic states in particular, yes, they are vulnerable to attack, and they need to be better postured. And to do this, we must work with our Baltic friends to increase the amount of time that they can resist an armed attack, and then reduce the response time it takes for NATO to respond to an attack. And there'll be plenty of media issues speaking to that at the summit on the agenda. The upcoming NATO summit gives us an opportunity to move in this direction through our initiatives at NATO to improve readiness. So the 430s initiative, improve our ability to transport military equipment across Europe. So those are the military mobility issues that we're working on with the EU. Adaptations to the NATO command structure, improvements to the alliance's speed of decision making, and improvements in interoperability. We feel like we can significantly reduce the time it takes for a response force to mobilize and counter any attack. And of course, we're also working to ensure NATO has the capability to respond to hybrid threats and improve cyber defenses, as you've already heard mentioned today. Now, fulfilling our defense spending commitments are absolutely critical to achieving a strengthened deterrence and defense posture. And our position here, I think, is very clear. Meeting the Wales commitments of 2% of defense spending, of GDP for defense spending, and 20% capability goals, these are imperative, and we expect the good progress shown in recent years to continue. The President will be clear and frank on this point at the summit. Much has been done, but with 13 of 28 allies that still lack national plans, there's considerable work yet to be done, and the U.S. will continue to press for fair and equitable burden sharing as an essential component of alliance unity and cohesion. Yeah, thanks.
There we go. All right. General Gorentz, you want to take it away?
Thank you. I spent the majority of my final assignment in the Air Force trying to implement Wales and Warsaw, and I'm looking forward to the summit coming up to see where we are and what we're doing. But I think fundamentally what we're dealing with is change from the bottom up in the environment that we're having to deal with. This is nothing new. People ask me, I often tell people, I was in the United States Air Force, but I served in 4 different Air Forces. And those Air Forces all changed because of a symbolic collapse of the world environment that we had to adjust to. So I started out in the Cold War Air Force. 10 years after I came in, miraculously, we won the war. The Berlin Wall collapsed. We immediately transitioned to the no-fly zone Air Force because all the vacuums of power created a new environment, and we had to fundamentally change our Air Force and operated in the no-fly zone Air Force until the collapse of the World Trade Center thrust us into the global war on terror Air Force. And I loved the serving in all of those air forces. I loved the global war on terror Air Force, serving in it. And then the Wall Street guys bundled some bad loans, called it a good investment, and Wall Street collapsed. And we became, I called it, the global war on terror under severe fiscal austerity Air Force. And we adjusted to that. And so I believe we're in the middle of a collapse. I don't know what it is. I don't know where the Air Force is going to be, but clearly NATO went through all of those changes too, and still NATO is the most successful alliance in the history of man, stability and security all over the place, particularly in Europe. And so what I want to do in my introductory remarks is talk about the constant there, and that was the missions of NATO. NATO primarily is a political military organization with three missions: deterrence, collective defense, crisis management, and then cooperative security. And we were focused on deterrence and collective defense till 1989, and then the Cold War ended and we immediately began doing crisis management. And we did that until 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea, and immediately it snapped everybody back into the collective defense deterrence mindset. And I think deterrence is very important, but deterrence is tricky. And somebody mentioned it already. Where you sit is how you see it. And the question is what we face now an existential threat or not? And if it's not an existential threat, what kind of threat is it? And so what kind of force, what kind of NATO do we want to have to do deterrence? And I think it's important to discuss deterrence. And I'm hoping that besides the obligatory statement on we are a nuclear deterrence organization, they always have that in every communique. But I think it's important to understand deterrence. And I think deterrence is tricky because it's not only nuclear deterrence, but it's also conventional deterrence. And it's the interplay between conventional deterrence and nuclear deterrence that determines how the potential adversaries interact with each other. And I think it's important to define deterrence, and there's a lot of ways. Peace through strength was always kind of the underpinning of deterrence, and essentially deterrence was an incentive to avoid war rather than the wage war. And to make it clear to any potential adversary that anything that they hope to gain through some kind of provocative action will not be worth it because of the reaction that they can expect. And so deterrence, in the end, is, I would say, a three-legged stool. Capability, capacity, and willingness. Fundamentally. You can look at it a million different ways, but there has to be capability in the military force. There has to be a capacity in the military force. And then, of course, the potential adversary has to believe that you are willing to enact, in this case, collective defense under Article 5 of NATO. And then there's our biggest potential adversary. I know there's a discussion on the threat from the south in whatever form you want it, migration, whatever. It doesn't matter, but the bottom line is there are clearly two views of the threat, but Russia is the most concerning. The U.S. national security strategy makes that perfectly clear, and Russia clearly has been acting in a way underneath the threshold of conflict because they figured it out. They figure out how to avoid any kind of response. And in the end, Europe is full of frozen conflicts. Of course, we have Crimea and Ukraine. Crimea is interesting, by the way, because, that was a change of international border by force. And yes, we protested it, but nobody did nothing. Nobody did anything about it, really. And in the end, remember, that came 25 years after a coalition of the willing responded to a change in an international border by force in the form of the Gulf War. If you remember, the United States deployed 500,000 people to react to that violation of the international liberal rules-based world order that we fondly want to maintain across the world right now. And of course, along the way, the Russians have increased their capabilities, they've increased their capacities, and they've increased their rhetoric, particularly with respect to their willingness to resort to a nuclear escalate to de-escalate kind of strategy, which is in itself a form of deterrence. And so there's some realities, I think, that we need to face. And the bottom line is, it's already been mentioned in the form of percentages of GDP and things like that, but potential power is not real power until you invest, until you organize properly to meet the threat. It's not real power. And we just need to realize that, we need to talk about it, and then we need to get it in place. If deterrence fails, collective response, it has to be swift. That's the discussion with respect to increased speed of decision making in order to provide credibility for the deterrence. There's a threat. The bottom line is the enemy has a vote. And unfortunately, NATO has never experienced a failure of deterrence. Only one Article 5 response in the history of NATO, and it's hard to deter terrorists. But I think we have to keep that in mind because we've never really had to deal with it. And then, of course, the force has to be ready, deployable, and sustainable. And we can talk about that through your questions. So I think I'll end up there. I have a few solutions that I think are low-hanging fruit, but I'll wait till the questions and answers in order to bring those out.
Great, thanks, sir. And as General said, there will be question and answer time, so just start thinking about these things. Mr. Secretary, if you want to take it away.
Thank you. Absolutely, and thank you, first of all, for inviting me and for the great event. I was stationed at our embassy in D.C., I think 4 or 5 years ago, and I remember back then it was impossible to find an event that would deal with NATO and deterrence and defense. I mean, I guess there were events, but they never attracted groups the size of this. This is obviously partly because of the changes in the security environment, but I think also partly because of the great work that the Atlantic Council has been doing. So first of all, I just want to thank everybody who works at the Atlantic Council, and also thank all of you for being interested in European security and transatlantic relations. I think this is truly important. And thank you for inviting us. I will talk about defense and deterrence. I'll talk where you sit, where you stand does indeed depend on where you sit. So I will talk about defense and deterrence from the perspective of Estonia. I think overall we've made great progress over the past 4 or 5 years when it comes to our own, but also the alliance's collective deterrence posture. From our perspective, the posture has 3 crucial components. First, obviously, our own capabilities, so the so-called Article 3 commitment, our own defense forces. Estonia contributes more than 2% of the GDP towards defense. Latvia and Lithuania are in that club as well. So from one perspective, that is obviously great news. On the other hand, obviously, as very small nations, our 2% gives us roughly 500 million euros annually. That is amongst the, I think, the lowest 5 in NATO when it comes to defense contributions in real terms. So even with more than 2% of GDP, we will continue to be a very, very small nation in a relatively difficult geographic position. This discussion on output, I think, is important. We would be the first ones, however, to point out that there is no output when there is no input. So both 2% or even above 2%, as well as making sure that each and every one of the euros and dollars that you spend is well spent, are both important. We in Estonia like to believe that we have created a system where we get the biggest bang for the buck. We still have mandatory conscription, a reserve-based military structure. We have not only demonstrated it on paper, but also in real terms. This spring, we conducted a large-scale military exercise where we brought together more than 16,000 servicemen and women. Now, more than 16,000, I mean, this is a big number, but when you consider the size of the population, which is 1.3 million, you get more than 1% of the whole population, including every infant, every elderly person. More than 1% of the whole population was in uniform, conducting military exercises in one chain of command in the Estonian countryside. So our own national defense forces, that's pillar number one. Pillar number two is allied presence. Allied presence, the most visible and arguably the most crucial element of allied presence, obviously in the Baltic states, EFP, NATO Enhanced Forward Presence, which has been a huge success story. We tend to concentrate, especially at events like this, on the problematic aspects of our posture and forget about the success stories. EFP is one of the greatest success stories NATO has had over the past few years, for sure. The decision was reached in a fast and timely manner at the summit in Warsaw. Consensus, obviously, in the alliance. It took us a few months to figure out the details of what was actually required and what the decision meant. So it was the defense ministerial in the fall after the Warsaw Summit when we had figured out what the battalion-sized battle group would mean. That would be, in our case, the United Kingdom as a framework nation. That would include roughly 1,200 soldiers, and so on and so forth. And that was in the fall timeframe. By late April, we had not only had each and every one of the soldiers with boots on the ground in Estonia. We had built up barracks. We had all of their weapon systems, ammunition, communications. We had figured out the enormously difficult legal frameworks, the rules of engagement. You can only imagine, for the first time in history, we had a French company subordinated to a British battalion, subordinated to an Estonian brigade. And by late April, we had them not only in Estonia, we had them conducting exercises within the Estonian 1st Brigade framework. So in roughly 6 months' time, a huge success story. But we also have the Baltic Air Policing, another element of Allied presence. We have other elements of presence, which is obviously of crucial importance. The presence of Allied forces in the Baltic states is the cornerstone and the backbone of the credibility of the Article 5 commitment in our region. Now that is, however, not enough. There is no Baltic-based solution to Baltic defense. So the third element, which makes the whole sort of posture whole, is an ability to reinforce, alliance's ability to reinforce, not only the Baltic region, but all the regions in the alliance. There are certain specifics related to our geographic position, but you know, in the large scheme of things, an ability to reinforce all regions of the alliance is dependent upon a few crucial sort of things. First, obviously, military readiness. You need to have the forces if you want to reinforce. Is a no-brainer. Secondly, military mobility has been mentioned oftentimes here today. Military mobility obviously has a physical dimension to it. Do we have the roads, the railroads, the bridges? Are they up to date? Do we know where they are? It has a regulatory aspect to it. Are our procedures streamlined in a way that the military forces can actually move and not move in wartime, but also move in peacetime without getting stuck in customs clearing processes. Military mobility also includes the question of prepositioning of equipment, which obviously is a part of getting there faster. A discussion that we need to have. A functioning command and control system. NCS has been, NATO command structure has been mentioned today, but also NATO force structure needs to be up to date. And finally, planning and exercising. Planning and exercises where it's not the plan that we are after, but a planning process that is of importance. And an exercises tempo that not only forces us to test our plans and hence get better at defending, but also sends a clear message to everybody who is paying attention that we are not only willing but also capable of, if necessary, reinforcing all of the regions of the alliance if there is a requirement to do that. So I think these are the elements. We have made huge progress over the past few years. It would, however, be a grave mistake to consider security as some kind of a project-based topic where you've ticked the box and hence solved it. Warsaw, the summit was wonderful. The decisions have been implemented, but that doesn't mean that we are at an end of the road. We need to continue working on enhancing our posture. And I think we need to concentrate, especially in the upcoming summit, on the reinforcement part and the different elements that make up the reinforcement ability. I think we're on the way, and I'm very hopeful and very optimistic that we will indeed be able to get the right decisions from the summit and then work forward from there. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Maybe this is a good follow-up to that then, because I'm going to take moderator privilege and ask the first question here. And I want to put you all on the spot a little bit and play a little hypothetical what if. Let's say Secretary General Stoltenberg comes to you all tomorrow and says, we've already prearranged, all 29 countries are on board, and whatever you identify as the most urgent step that we have to take right now to make sure we increase our deterrence, we're all willing to go ahead and do it. But you have to give us one thing that's your most urgent step. What would your response be? Maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think it's clear. I think it's a nationally approved plan by all 29 to meet the whales targets. Everything else flows from that. That's the essential precondition for alliance unity and cohesion as we see it.
Generally agree?
That's important. I do think that my number one thing that I would ask for is to increase the readiness of the forces that are already available. You know, it's not clear where that is. It's not clear what we actually have ready to go on a certain timeline. And I think that I would spend considerable effort and time and resources to make sure that what we possess as an alliance across the board is ready to go to a sufficient level to provide a robust collective defense.
Mr. Secretary?
Well, I agree with both of these points. But
you only get one.
Well, just to create it, make it more interesting, I'll say something else. Even though I do agree with both of them, and by the way, it doesn't work that way. The Secretary General doesn't get to ask this one thing. We can't really fix security.
It's a magical hypothetical.
Yeah, I know. So no silver bullets in security. No silver bullets. But if I were to say something, then I'd probably say an enhanced planning and exercising sort of schedule for the alliance that would deal with the hypothetical challenges that we might face in a 360 degree context. That would create more cohesion into everything that we do in the alliance, not only in the east, in the south, elsewhere. I would probably say something along those lines. This, however, is not doable without readiness of military forces, which in turn not doable without 2%, or at least 2% of defense spending. So it's all obviously interconnected.
It does seem like some sort of planning and exercise schedule, increased exercising, increased planning, could be something that could come out of the summit or at least future agreements, right?
I'm absolutely certain good things will not only come out of the summit, but out of the NAC, the North Atlantic Council meets every week, and they make good decisions out every week. Most of the decisions are not flashy. I mean, you cannot really write headlines or create wonderful slogans out of them. It is most of what we do is mundane, relatively boring, but crucially important for making sure that the alliance works. So yes, the summit will be hopefully successful, but so are the less visible events that or meetings that the alliance has.
And let me ask, since we are in Washington, is there something for each of your thoughts, requirements, that this administration, Secretary Mattis, Mr. Goffus, could do in the short term to try to get at people on track to reach those goals, to reach those targets? Aside from, obviously, this administration has made the 2% very clear that's what they want. Are there things that can happen short term to kind of make sure everyone's on this right path to each of these three goals, if you will?
Well, if I can answer about the whales targets, I have to give very high marks to the Pentagon, to the Secretary, to Tom Goffus and everyone in between. They've missed no opportunity to press this point. It's always a topic that the Secretary leads with the defense ministerials and his interactions with counterparts here in Washington and in capitals, as it is with us in the White House. So I can't fault them for pressing hard on this point. I think they do an excellent job there. I think the comprehension of the expectation is high.
That seems a fair statement.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think to the extent that we can, given all of the worldwide commitments that the United States has, I mean, I think there's been a pretty clear message that Europe is important to us. I think a lot of people underestimate the comment that Mr. Goffus made on the impact of that extra money in the form of the European Defense Initiative on top of everything else. And I have to say that that's not sexy stuff, but for an airman, there's nothing more exciting than an airfield that is actually capable of generating high volume combat operations with fuel and weapons and those kinds of things. And I can assure you there's so much work to do in those areas that have to be done, that have been facilitated, by that extra funding. It's really exciting, and I do think that it does reflect on the commitment that we have to the alliance and to Europe.
Mr. Secretary, last chance here.
Well, usually the success of a summit is determined partly by the success of the defense ministerial and the foreign ministerial that come before the summit. And as Tom Goffus mentioned, the defense ministerial that just concluded in Brussels was successful. So the most important thing from our perspective is for us to not become too happy with the progress that we have already made. I mean, we need to be impatient and require faster progress on all of the different things that are being worked on today, and that was basically the message that came out of the defense ministerial. So I think we are well on track, and there's a lot of desire in the alliance to move us forward and move us forward faster than we would move forward if bureaucrats got to run the show. So I think that's good.
Fair enough. All right, folks, so we're ready for questions. Just a reminder, a question is a question. If you have an op-ed, Defense News certainly welcomes you submitting that for publication. Please don't share it with us right now. We're going to start with this gentleman right here, and if you can just say who you are, who you're with, and speak into the mic, which is over there.
Thank you very much for you all today. My name is Danny Anderson, coming from the Jamestown Foundation. I had a question mostly for Mr. Hooker. So this administration has not said that much on Ukraine specifically, and I was curious, is there anything on the agenda in this upcoming NATO summit regarding Russian naval actions in Azov and further protecting the Kerch Strait? Thank you.
Yeah, I can give you a general answer to that. I think the NATO summit is in the agenda is in the process of being finalized right now. I think we're almost there. We're not quite there. I think the expectation is that there will be a focus session on Black Sea security issues that would take that into consideration, and that if approved, that would include at the head of state level participation by Ukraine and Georgia, as well as the formal NATO allies.
All right. This gentleman in the white shirt here.
Thank you very much. Ariel Cohen of the Atlantic Council. The question to Mr. Hooker, if you can describe your perception of the trajectory Turkey is on right now, especially vis-a-vis the Black Sea, the Crimea, Georgia, etc. And a question to the Air Force General, what is your assessment, to the extent you can share, with vis-a-vis the new Russian airframes such as Sukhoi 57, the so-called stealth fighter, and the upgrades of the old platforms that we see in the form of Sukhoi 35 and things like that? Thank you.
So first, thank you for limiting your Turkey question to the Black Sea. That's great. We can talk for a long time about Turkey right now. I'm glad we don't have to. First of all, it goes without saying, I think that Turkey is a major power in the Black Sea and a big part of the security equation when it comes to how NATO sees the Black Sea and reacts to security challenges that we may find there. It's got a strong naval presence. Geography, of course, it gives it that sort of leading position. The Turks have not talked about Black Sea issues to us aggressively or publicly all that much. I think in part that's because of the situation it finds itself in with respect to Russia right now, which of course is involved actively inside Syria, bordering country with Turkey. It's been a tense relationship at times, but it's a relationship that Turkey finds itself compelled to engage in, understandably. And so Turkey hasn't pushed the Black Sea as an agenda item in NATO particularly, but will be a big part of any solutions going forward. And we expect, of course, we'll participate in any Black Sea discussions that happen at the summit.
I think your second question on the aircraft that you were talking about, I think, is a reflection of the Russian desire to increase their capacity and capability in the air. It's a logical progression to the idea that they've watched the Western alliances and coalitions of the willing do some unbelievable things from the air with respect to the ability to deliver precision-guided munitions and those kinds of things. And I just think it's a natural continuation of an effort to catch up. And it's a cycle that's likely to continue. The old administration started a process of, quote, the third offset to try and regain asymmetrical advantage inside the conventional capabilities, and so that's ongoing. But this is just a ebb and flow of history where people have enjoyed an advantage. We have enjoyed advantage from the air for a long time. Everybody's watched it. Everybody's catching up, and now we need to figure out how we're going to get it again with respect to maintaining that asymmetric advantage.
Piggybacking off of the earlier question about Ukraine, actually, just because it's in the news, feel we should ask about Macedonia. Obviously, there's a lot going on there. We don't know exactly what the situation seems to be, if there's an agreement or not. It seems like there is today. If there is an agreement and it's done and that issue appears to be solved, the U.S. has said it would support Macedonia and potentially join NATO if it met all the requirements and this issue was solved. Is that still the case for this administration? And how quickly could Macedonia join NATO? I mean, could we see some sort of action on this very quickly?
Yes. So the latest as of today, we think, is that the national leaders have agreed to a compromise on a naming convention for Macedonia. I believe that would still have to be ratified by the parliaments in both countries. And then there are some other steps that would have to take place to sort of fully implement this decision that have to do with some constitutional changes and other sorts of things. So it's not the kind of thing that can be implemented overnight. If it becomes apparent that both countries, are sincerely in agreement on this and have reached consensus, then I think NATO and certainly the United States would be supportive of this. NATO would be very interested in moving forward to consider membership by Macedonia in the alliance. Obviously, that's a decision that has to happen at 29, but we would support it.
Mr. Secretary, is Estonia in the same boat? Welcome to enlargement.
We are, absolutely.
All right. Questions? This lady in the white blazer, middle. You can stand up. And there we go. The microphone is on your right.
I'm Karin Shuey with the Estonian American National Council, and I'm just going to steal your question from the beginning of the panel and ask, what are Estonia's priorities for any deterrence initiative funding that might be coming your way?
Defense and deterrence, I'm sorry?
What are your priorities for any EDI funding that might be coming to Estonia?
Well, how long's the session? Can I give you the whole list or just a few things? U.S. support for our own defense development has been significant, and we're grateful for that. We have always said that it is important for us to receive assistance in areas or into areas where we have some development and some know-how, some development going on anyways, and some know-how. So I could bring you examples like Javelin missiles. It's a success story from a few years ago. We were about to procure Javelin missiles, wonderful anti-tank systems everybody is probably familiar with. The United States decided to assist us. which helped us procure more and better missiles. So we already had the know-how, we already had the structures, the personnel, helped us get bigger and get there faster than we otherwise would have. A lot of U.S. funding obviously is linked with the activities that the United States Armed Forces undertake in Europe, where they conduct exercises with the Estonian forces. For instance, in the Baltic states, we just had, I think we still continue to have F-16s from the United States in Estonia in the MR Air Base, where they conduct exercises together with our forces, but also with the British helicopters, for instance. We have the French conducting Baltic air policing at the moment. So all of this is crucially important, not only symbolically. This is how we build interoperability in the alliance. And these things cost a lot of money. I mean, deploying F-16s, I can only imagine what it must have cost the United States, helping us improve the infrastructure at MR Air Base. I know exactly how much that costs, and it's not insignificant. We invest in our military bases, but the United States has been very helpful in getting us there again faster. So these sorts of things. But there are lists, obviously, and we do exchange these lists with our colleagues in the United States administration.
All right. Any other questions in the back here? Oh, right here, sir, in the front. Microphone's coming.
Thanks very much. Sandy Burke out of the Atlantic Council, former Deputy Secretary General of NATO. I'd like to ask General Lawrence, but the others can comment too, a couple questions about the role of air power and air defense in the defense of the Baltic states. As of when you left NATO, did NATO have enough air power available to bring sufficient air power to bear to support the EFP battalions of one of the Baltic states under attack? And secondly, what is your view on the requirement for ground-based air defense in the Baltic states, and should that be provided by NATO collectively, given how expensive it might be for the Baltic states themselves to field?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be perfectly honest. You know, when I became the NATO Allied Air Commander back in 2013, I had to ask around really what air policing was. I wasn't exactly sure what that meant. I knew why we were doing it, and I've been an advocate. One of the big things that I think that NATO should do that really wouldn't cost a dime, because it's really a well-supported mission, is let's go back to air defense. Because air defense is a mindset. And right now, air policing is an activity that really deals with airplanes and a set of radars and things like that, but air defense is much more than that. It's also ground-based air defense, and it's also airspace control measures. And that's how the Joint Commander would control a conflict in the air. And I believe that it would be good to practice that in peacetime with a full-up staff to be able to do the air defense. The air policing mission was very well supported by all of the allies. It was a standing mission in peacetime. I remember the first time I flew into Amari, and it was a fantastic base, and that was before the Ukraine, the Crimea happened. And I thought that would have been a good place to do air policing out of, and little did I know that 3 months later we would be doing it. And so it's a very well supported mission. But again, the issue is readiness. For the numbers of airplanes that we were dealing with the air policing mission, I felt really good about what we were able to accomplish in all of the missions. The question is, if deterrence fails on day one, how many airplanes are available? Yeah. Your answer is as good as mine, because honestly, I didn't know. So those are the kinds of things that I think are relatively low-hanging fruit, and not to impede on nation sovereignty, but it sure would be good to know what the readiness of the fleet is. If you have 10 airplanes, should 8 of them be ready? I personally believe that given the timelines with respect to some of the ground units readiness, that air power is going to play a big role if something happens in Europe. And so certainly I'd like to bolster that up. I also believe that there should be a standing mission focused on intelligence to feed a set of indications and warnings that would give the NAC much better fidelity day to day into the understanding on what's happening in Europe and around Europe. And I think that would be particularly helpful in addressing the strategic warning that will be available to the alliance. So overall, I felt pretty good. Overall, the modifications and the adaptations that were made first in Wales and Warsaw were a good step. I think now we could really ramp it up. And I love the effort in the Baltics with those battalions, but I sure wish they were joint. And I'm sure wish they were rounded out with all the enablers that would allow for some high fidelity training for those ground units in peacetime to get ready if deterrence fails. That's what deterrence is all about.
Yeah, if I could offer a couple of comments. The first would be that, in my humble opinion, the best form of air defense is another fighter plane. There's a lot of good news going on across the alliance. The Romanians are buying Patriot, the Poles are buying Patriot, the Swedes are buying Patriot. But Patriot's an expensive system. Because of scale, some of the smaller NATO countries they just can't afford the sort of capital investment that's required, which means it falls more on the shoulders of the larger, better financed NATO allies and the United States itself. But there's a whole lot that goes into this. A tremendous advantage that NATO has, I think, is in the air power domain. So we can gain and achieve air supremacy, which we always say at the outset we want to do. Then I think across the board we become much better postured. We're really in pretty good shape. We have a big problem with air defense, the A-squared AD bubble in Kaliningrad. And I know that the Pentagon is looking hard at that, working hard at that. That's a problem that's got to be solved, and it's not a problem that can be solved in months. It's got to be a problem that can be solved in days or a few weeks if we're going to get NATO's real advantages into the fight and therefore into the deterrence equation. So this is a field that we really need to be working hard. There's some really encouraging indicators out there, but there's a lot to be done as well. And one of them is command and control, as the general mentioned. We've really got to think through that very, very carefully, because airspace management and deconfliction and all of that is very technical, but it's very, very challenging.
Mr. Secretary.
Right, yeah. Well, I was just going to say that everything that the General just said is precisely the reason why we emphasize planning and exercising. We have to figure out how best to utilize the assets that we already have in the region, which are not insignificant. I mean, on top of the EFPs, obviously, we have our own forces, we have the air policing operation. The great thing about airplanes is that they obviously move fast. You can deploy them. We as NATO, we have significant numbers of air assets in Europe, also obviously in North America. Unless we know exactly what we want to do with them, we're not going to be able to move fast. And also, this is where exercising comes into play. We need to exercise on a routine basis to test our plans, test our concepts, but also in order to increase our interoperability. We used to talk a lot about interoperability during the days of ISAF, for instance, when we had deployed thousands of NATO troops into Afghanistan, where we had to make sure that the forces could work together. Usually, the integration of forces took place at the battalion level. Now, with the EFP, for instance, we have, in some cases, a platoon from one nation, located within a company of another nation. So, interoperability needs to take place at a totally different level. And this is ground forces. When you bring air forces into play, ground-based air defense into play, interoperability becomes a huge topic, probably topic number one. So can't really fix that unless we get very, very good at planning and exercising. And once we get very, very good at planning, and we will never be perfect at that, because what usually happens is always going to be a surprise. I mean, and usually whenever something happens, you find out that all of your plans are inadequate. But at least we would be better at interoperability and at figuring out the exact force structure that would be necessary. There are no silver bullets. It's probably going to be a combination of different assets. And I think mentioning Baltic air policing is really important because these are assets that the Allies already have in the Baltic nations. So oftentimes military capabilities cost a lot of money. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes you already have the assets in place and need to think through the rules of engagement and perhaps command and control relationships to make them function in other capacities as well.
Well, I have a lot of
If I could also
just
add one
quickly.
thing. I do think that right now is a real opportunity to explore some pooling and sharing arrangements with allies that could never afford their own system, but they could contribute to one to be operated together. NATO AWACS is a classic example of that. What's beautiful about NATO AWACS is, there's some 11 nations, I think, still in the memorandum, but none of the, but 8 of them don't have AWACS of their own. But they are exposed to the airborne command and control mission, and so they understand interoperability better. And so I would argue that, a NATO Patriot unit, a NATO THAAD unit, a NATO remotely piloted aircraft unit, a NATO Intel PED unit, processing, exploitation, and dissemination unit, these things that need to be explored to provide structural interoperability efforts that would enable to elevate the knowledge of all of our allies to what modern warfare, particularly from the air, has become.
On that note, obviously a lot of stuff we could follow up with, and I encourage you to follow up with some of the following panels. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Please join me in thanking these fantastic guests. I think we had a lot to talk about here. And we're going to invite the Atlantic Council's Barry Pavel to come up and introduce our next speaker. Thanks very much.
That's a little better. I now have the pleasure of introducing 2 fantastic speakers. First, I'm delighted to introduce Congressman Michael Turner, who will be addressing the evolution and state of U.S. leadership in Europe, as well as the transatlantic relationship. I'm going to give a very short introduction because he has a vote on the Hill very soon. I think you have his bio, but certainly, most importantly, he's chairman of the House Armed Services Committee Subcommittee on Strategic Forces, and previously, he was appointed chairman of the U.S. delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and in 2014, he was elected president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And so with that, please join me in welcoming Congressman Turner to the stage.
Great, thank you. Thank you for having me. I want to thank the Atlantic Council for focusing today on the issues of, I understand, the upcoming NATO summit in Brussels and the effects and certainly what the agenda should be of the transatlantic relationship. I was excited to come and speak to you about this today in reflecting also on the last summit. At the last summit, as you were indicating, I was the president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. When I walked in the room, I was the first to address the heads of state. So if you can imagine walking through, Sandy would know this feeling. We walk into the room, and the individuals that are there, of course, are Obama and Merkel and Trudeau and their ministers of state and their ministers of defense. And it gives you some focus of the aspect that truly the transatlantic alliance and certainly NATO does operate at the highest levels, just as it does on the lowest levels of just our interoperability of our defense organizations. I had the opportunity of addressing them and presenting what was, at that time, the perspective of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, of our parliamentarians, as to what NATO should be focusing on. Of course, we talked about some of the issues that are very familiar to all of you, the issue of infrastructure, that as we're looking at how to ensure now the greater defense of Europe, we have to make certain that we have the ability to transport, that we have the ability to move equipment and people, burden sharing, making certain that we live up to the Wales commitment of all of our allies reaching the 2%, And then the third item, which is really a shift overall in NATO's perspective, and that was the return to deterrence, and even the embracing of nuclear deterrence, of recognizing that adversaries self-select, and you have to be prepared to invest in deterrence itself in order to ensure security. We also got to talk about the issue of the open door policies. You know, Montenegro at that point, we were just on the verge of Montenegro becoming a member, and the open door, we had grave concerns that it had atrophied, that no one had walked through it, and we were very excited to be able to, as an assembly, advocate for Montenegro to join us, and are very, very pleased that they have since. The NATO Parliament Assembly came together again just recently in Warsaw. Stoltenberg came before us and gave us his priorities for the upcoming NATO summit. And they're very similar to the issues that we've all been struggling with and that we discussed in Warsaw, and that is deterrence and defense, the return to deterrence and defense. And it was great to hear him make such a strong statement of what that's going to take. And if you look at this as an issue both of investment, of equipment, of modernization, of capabilities, that return to that focus was his main pillar of what he's looking for as he goes to Brussels for 2018 for the new summit. He made the point that of the 2% on the Wales commitment, that at the time that the Wales commitment was made, only 3 countries were making it to that 2% level, but that 8 today are, and a majority have a plan to get there. But he continued to push the countries need to make this a priority. Now, what's interesting for us in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly is we meet with our fellow parliamentarians. I mean, obviously, those that participate in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly are already defense-oriented. They already have a security focus or a defense advocacy responsibility in their own parliaments. But they'll tell stories about being in their own parliaments and turning to fellow parliamentarians and saying, we need to increase our investment, and have the return be, well, why do we have to? We're in NATO. As if NATO is such an assurance that it allowed them to, on the cheap, participate. Now with the 2% call and countries rising to that, I think people are shifting their focus and understanding that the answer isn't, why should we have to? We're in NATO. The answer now is, we have to because we're in NATO. And it's interesting to watch as across the European countries that they begin to implement their plans, how politically people now even try to take credit for being the impetus for the increased investment. He talked about stability and recognizing Russian aggression and Russian meddling. He talked about EU partnerships and focused on the issue of infrastructure there. He talked about modernization and interoperability. It was interesting in looking at the EU issue, our concerns with infrastructure really is an area where the EU has an ability to step up, both in looking at standards and investment to ensure that we have a greater ability to mobilize within our NATO partners and within Europe. Now, we have some successes to celebrate, it's great having Sandy here because he was such a champion as we were looking for the European Reassurance Initiative, what we're also calling now the European Defense Initiative, and the forward placement of our troops. I think everyone sees not only that as a success, is that the United States rallied both for footing the bill, but also looking to our allies and getting them to commit to the forward placement of troops. But I think people also, in looking in retrospect, believe it is having an effect on Russia. I think Zapad, as you look to that exercise and what the concerns were as to what it could be, people believe that the fact that our resolve for forward placing of troops and for our allies coming together may have had an effect and downscaled that, may have an effect on overall Russian aggression. And if you think back to the RAND study where we had a concern of what would it take to actual deter, and we think in terms of just deterrence of what would it take to win, we're seeing that deterrence at times can be just a presence and an understanding of a commitment to resources and presence. And I think that's something that's important to celebrate in this upcoming summit. Now, one of the things that I called for when I was speaking in Warsaw that I think is a challenge that we need to lay down to our European allies is the United States stepped up. We did a European Reassurance Initiative. It's time for an American Reassurance Initiative for our European allies to respond to that. And it's not just in the 2%. It's in a willingness for 2%. It's in a leadership position of stating that they are going to invest in a way that is meaningful and contributing to their overall defense. Now, I want to give you the challenge that I think that we are missing overall as we look to NATO and our responsibilities, and the Atlantic Council has certainly an incredible role in that. And that is, we have to take on the task of ensuring democracy within NATO and our NATO allies. And, at times when we were looking at NATO enlargement, we leaned in. We went to our future allies, those who were aspiring, and we worked with them in partnerships and setting up democratic institutions and ensuring democratic principles. Today, some of those who are on the inside of the family of NATO are having threats to democratic institutions. And we need to get beyond just the concepts of our bureaucratic standpoint that we had when we were looking at the atrophying of the open door policy and looking at checking boxes on democratic institutions. We need to lean in to advancing those shared values, advancing those concepts among our allies, and ensuring that that democracy stands, because some of our NATO partners, of course, don't have long institutional memories in democracy. And so we need to aid them as we go forward. Now, I wanted to end with the quote that when I spoke at the last summit. I made a statement that I think is one that we need to reflect on almost for every summit, and really as we look forward to our responsibilities in NATO, and I want to read this to you. NATO's members, partners, and adversaries may change. However, the threat that leaders of other nations may attack their own populations or seek to dominate their neighbors will not. Aggression will not be defeated by the passage of time or a century of new ideas. Security can only be assured by credible military forces that can deter and defend against those who would do us harm. Our constituents lock their doors at night, not because that they believe that their neighbors are murderers and thieves, but because that they believe not doing so would be irresponsible for the protection of their families. Similarly, underfunding deterrence irresponsibly places our NATO family at risk. Dialogue is important to avoid conflicts, but it cannot offset the investment necessary for deterrence. As we look forward to this NATO summit, we must be very mindful that at its heart, NATO is a defense alliance. Although we come together across the Atlantic and with the Transatlantic Alliance with shared values and many bilateral and many different multilateral relationships, NATO itself is at its heart a defense alliance. And as we focus on that, as we go forward with this summit, we can ensure the security and the safety of all of our peoples and of our allies. And with that, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congressman Turner, for your very thoughtful remarks. It's now my distinct pleasure to welcome and introduce Congressman Ruben Gallego. Congressman Gallego represents Arizona's 7th District. Prior to joining Congress, he enlisted in the Marine Corps and deployed to Iraq in 2005 as an infantryman. And following his service in Iraq, he has focused on U.S. foreign and defense policy in Congress. He was first elected to the Arizona House of Representatives in 2010, and he served until 2014 there. Following this, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 2014 and is currently in his 4th year of service. He serves on the House Armed Services Committee and as well as the Natural Resources Committee. In addition, he serves as a senior whip for the Democratic Caucus, the second vice chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, vice chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and vice chair of the Equality Caucus. Quite a number of responsibilities. And with that, I would like to welcome the Congressman to the stage for his keynote remarks.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Mr. Pavel. I hope to one day not need an introduction here at the Atlantic Council, but since I do, it's Gallego, just for the reporters. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. I want to thank, first of all, Mr. Turner for his remarks. Throughout our time together on the committee, he and I have had a few disagreements, but broadly speaking, when it comes to NATO, strategy, and general deterrence, you cannot have a stronger voice, whether it's Democrat or Republican, on that committee than Representative Turner. we are going to be quite poor because of his absence. Mr. Chairman, and I know that I'll personally miss your voice of reason on the other side of the aisle where it is desperately needed. And it's been an honor to serve with you, Mike. It really has. And I think, a lot of us will be talking about all the great work you've done, for the many years after. And I'm sure you will not be a total stranger. On the issue of the NATO summit, I understand that you've heard, and we'll hear later, a number of viewpoints about keeping pressure on the Russians, some including considering Poland for basing, some cyber and hybrid defense capabilities, and other ideas. My mission, coming from the Hill and from the opposition, the loyal opposition, is to let you know of the deep well of support that you have there, and the backstop that we provide when it comes to American foreign policy. Both Putin and other opponents of NATO can do damage, and of course they have, if you look at what they've done to Estonian infrastructure, French elections, and democratic legitimacy in general all over the world. We on the Hill know that Russia's threat to NATO members is clear. There is broad, bipartisan, near unanimity on the existence of this threat and its seriousness. When I say broad bipartisan, it is on both sides, certainly at least in Congress, and I could feel fairly comfortable saying that for the Senate. Anyone can see that Russian military actions in Syria, Ukraine, and Georgia, and the hybrid attacks we've seen in Estonia, France, Germany, the UK, and here in the United States, shows that they have a clear intent and capability to attack the free peoples of the world using sophisticated military and political weapons and to wither our alliances. The threat is persistent. For a decade now, Russia has prioritized its military budget and has practiced fighting modern wars along its frontier. It has a small army of cheap but capable cyber warriors, and they are practicing in the art of elections. And we'll hopefully not see that soon, but I believe they'll be back for 2018. Putin's view that Russia got a raw deal at the end of the Cold War is flawed, but it is his view, and he truly does believe it. He certainly has put a lot of effort behind trying to drive the wedge that we are seeing right now, or the attempted wedge we're seeing between our allies and to try to basically beat NATO without actually ever having to fight NATO. In light of this threat, we should be focusing on reinforcing our alliance. And I say we, obviously the United States, as well as NATO, and doubling down when we do that when it comes to our funding priorities, and working to address any of the weaknesses so we can confidently keep what was the longest running peace on mainland Europe. And despite this, and despite the unique and quite frankly counterproductive messaging that you're hearing from the White House and from the President, I believe, in fact, we are still doing that. In the Armed Services Committee, in the House, and in the wider Congress, there is no question of where our direction is. We get the briefings, we take the meetings with people like Minister Karoblis and others. And despite the stereotype of congressional gridlock, we acted, and we have acted, and we will continue to act. This year, for example, Mr. Turner brought this up, during the Armed Services Committee markup of the National Defense Authorization Act, we had a lot of very, very public fights. There were more than a few instances when I looked over on the other side and was wondering what my friend Mike was thinking and his colleagues. And I'm sure they looked at my side and said the same thing. The one area, and many areas that nobody actually, one area that is profound and deep but was not widely reported was the unanimity in support of EDI. It was, one of the things that passed quietly through the night because both sides essentially recognized that this is a need and that we're not going to fight for something that we both identify as a priority in terms of keeping and strengthening our relationship with our NATO partners. Now, you'll see other attempts to actually reinforce this and have. For example, the Armed Services Committee has also set out statements specifically saying about what our U.S. policy is to NATO, as well as our steadfast connection to other NATO allies. Additional funds for lethal aid to Ukraine so it can better defend itself against Russia also passed without much rancor between the parties. We've also given direction to the Department of Defense for a strategy to counter Russia as a major enemy in all its ways that it's trying to fight us and its allies. And last but not least, as I said, our increase to European Deterrence Initiative, or EDI. Of course, there have been some missteps at the White House, and they are serious in terms of what they've said, who they said it to, and how they've said it. What happened in Canada should worry us. At the G7, it was a very unfortunate thing to see to see such a friend and an ally like Canada being treated in that manner, and someone who has supported us in some very dangerous places in this world. I have very serious concerns about what just happened in Singapore. As a matter of fact, I actually can't quite understand what actually happened in Singapore, which I think should worry us even more. And more concerning than all, the fact that he called off a military exercise without even talking to your partner or ally, South Korea, who, by the way, was supposed to be in that military exercise. That is not how you should act. And I spoke to the South Korean ambassador today in my office, and he was very diplomatic, and I was not. As someone who has visited South Korea and been lucky enough to meet the forces there, both American and Republic of Korea, I've been extremely impressed by the professionalism, and this is not something I think you do to a friend and an ally. These moments really represent the real body blows to our relationship with allies. Now, I'm not saying that they're the deadly body blows, but we have gone through worse, and we need to continue to push forward. Many in this room may remember the bad old days of the freedom fries in the congressional cafeteria. Remember the lack of freedom fries when we tried to punish the French because they declined to join us in the Iraq War. As somebody who served in Iraq and in combat and recognized the problems and the consequences of what occurred in that war, I really wish we had actually listened to one of our oldest allies and used their knowledge and their understanding and not gone into Iraq. But where are we right now with the French? If you would have asked many people, back in those days that our alliance was somehow going to be ripped up with France, you could not even tell. Right now, they are our closest ally when it comes to fighting terrorism in Africa. It was the French that helped our troops in contact in Niger. They have continued to keep their nuclear deterrent and have been an important voice when it comes to alliance matters. And so much so that Macron is quite well respected, I would say, by both sides of the aisle here in Congress. In other words, we do have a mature adult relationship with them, and as a friend and a capable ally. They stood up to us. They took really unjustified and adolescent criticism, and when they turned out that they were right, and we turned out to be wrong, they brought us back with open arms. That is a true friend, and that is a true ally. But to be fair to the alliance, that discord was, at some level, always and unfortunately is an illusion, because our connection will continue to run deep. Though maybe the freedom fries now or something else, maybe now that we're in fights with the Canadians, we're going to start dodging whatever donuts from Tim Hortons. But it's going to continue because we have deeper ties that go beyond the elected officials through our military and other great government and staff and professional staff that continue working through different administrations. And when you look at the wider U.S. defense relationship with NATO and in Europe, the proof of commitment is not only there, it's obvious, it's healthy, and it's growing. So, looking forward to the summit. Countries like Lithuania and our other allies should think about how to accommodate this White House style, I would say, and rest easy knowing that the bulk of our commitment will only get stronger because you have Congress as a backstop. Right now, for example, the Army is testing 100 to 400 kilometer range artillery because it has to. Mind you, being tested in Arizona, thank you very much. Sorry, I have to put a plug in. And next year, we'll talk seriously in Congress about basing in Poland and more permanent forces in general in NATO to buttress our conventional deterrence and create mass. Personally, if I have anything else to say about it, and hopefully I do, let's see what happens with the re-election, we'll start considering additional deployments and agreements with NATO and bilaterally with NATO members to ensure that our qualitative military edge or the Russians is retained on NATO's eastern and northern flanks. So for this summit, I recommend that participants go to war, to paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld, go to war with the allies that you have, not the allies that you want. Focus on symbols of unity rather than speeches. Showcase countries that have met their 2% of GDP target and the 20% capital acquisition target as models for the alliance. Meanwhile, civil servants, professional appointees, and the military in our governments, supported and directed by Congress, will continue to deepen the strategic partnership that we have forged with the original alliance since 1949. And as always we have done, we will meet our threats today and emerge even stronger tomorrow, no matter who they may be. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Representative Gallego. We're going to take a short 10-minute break, coffee break, before the last panel. So thanks very much and enjoy the break.
thank you for rejoining us for our final session of our final panel of the day. We've had a lot to think about this afternoon, and we're going to wrap it with a panel on the Alliance agenda on the road to Brussels, the 360-degree view. We'll include everything from the actual flank security to hybrid threats to basically the cyber warfare that is going on. So to introduce our panelists, I'm Tara Kopp. I'm the Pentagon Bureau Chief of Military Times. And to my left is Michael Murphy. He's a career Foreign Service officer and the current Director for Security and Political Military Affairs at the U.S. State Department. And part of his role right now includes managing U.S. relations to NATO. So I am looking forward to talking to you about the upcoming summit. To his left is Dr. Fabrizio Luccioli. He's the president of the Atlantic Treaty Organization and president of the Italian Atlantic Committee. He's a 15-year professor at the Italian Ministry of Defense, specializing in military policy. To his left, Ambassador Sandy Vershbow, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, former Deputy Secretary to NATO, and former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security, focusing on Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and also is a Scowcroft Fellow. And then finally, Laura Rosenberger, a German Marshall Fund Fellow and former foreign policy advisor to the Hillary Clinton presidential campaign. You're also former National Security Council staffer, and with a focus on the Asia-Pacific region. And we'll be focusing on the Russian hybrid threat. So much like my colleague, I'm going to let each of our panelists kick it off with about 3 to 5 minutes of comments, and then we'll go to questions.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. I'm not going to try to steal anybody else's thunder, but I want to make 2 quick observations about deterrence and defense. Tom did a terrific job focusing in on laser-like on the 4 Pentagon priorities that Secretary Mattis has laid out and that were discussed at the Defense Ministerial. But there are 2 other important component parts of deterrence and defense that we are going to be working on as an alliance. Laura will speak about in more detail. But one is hybrid, the hybrid threat, and cyber. And I think there we also hope to make some important progress at the summit, including announcing counter-hybrid defense teams, and renewing some of the work and announcing some progress we've made on the cyber defense pledges that were made, I want to say at Warsaw, if I've got prying my memory correctly. So I just want to put that out there because it's the whole spectrum. It's not just the conventional or the nuclear, but it's also the asymmetric threats that we have to be concerned about. And cyber, of course, is now a domain, recognized as a domain of conflict within the alliance. So having said that, I really want to turn to the South and the 3rd priority area of the U.S. administration as we go into the summit. And we've talked about, and the President laid out very clearly at the May leaders meeting, that counterterrorism is an area where the alliance needs to step up its game. It's been engaged, but it needs to do more. And that's in part because the national security strategy lays this out pretty clearly. That is an enduring threat, an enduring challenge. And we tend to think about that as a problem as understandably emanating from the South, from the North Africa and Middle Eastern region. It's a little bit harder to get your heads around or your hand around. It's unlike the Eastern threat, which is fairly straightforward and simple to understand. I think the threats from the South are a little more nebulous. We talked about this over lunch today. But they're no less important. They're no less a challenge to the alliance. And when we look forward to the summit, we've got essentially 4 sort of summit priorities or summit outcomes we're moving towards. The 2 nearest and most immediate and highest headline grabbing are in Afghanistan, where we are looking as an alliance to work towards implementation of the South Asia strategy through a more robust RSM mission, the Resolute Support Mission, and of course through extending our commitment as allies to supporting the Afghan National Security Forces through 2024. And I would argue that we're in good shape in both those areas, that allies are doing a terrific job stepping up. Our fill rate for the mission, the RSM mission, is I think at its highest percentage that it's ever been, so that's positive. The second area is in Iraq, where I think Tom discussed it briefly. We're moving towards or trying to complete the planning for an Iraq mission, a NATO mission in Iraq, a training mission in Iraq, non-combat training mission in Iraq. And the defense ministers made progress. I know there's still some work going on in the alliance, but we anticipate being able to announce that at the summit as well. And then there are two other areas that I think are really important that get at the issue of adapting the alliance to deal with this threat, the challenges from the South, particularly counterterrorism, over the longer term. And I think about this just as we're thinking about adapting the alliance to deal with a different type of threat from the East, one that we didn't, until the historians will tell you 2007, but really we focused on in 2014, 2016, we weren't structured to deal with. We had to relearn some things. Well, terrorism is an enduring threat. Threats from the South are enduring, and the alliance has to adapt itself to be able to deal with those as well. And there are two areas, I think, that are really important to us, and they're really wonky. They're very NATO-ease, NATO nerdy, if I can put it that way. One is sort of, the functional review that the Secretary General has announced, where he takes a look at is the civilian side of the house, is the IS, are the structures, the policies, and the procedures that we have in place in the alliance, are they what we need to deal with the 360 environment we find ourselves in? Now, I would answer the question, and I think we would answer the question, no, they're not. So launching this and pushing this forward is very important, I think, to the long-term health of the alliance in terms of being able to deal with the South and the threats from counterterrorism. And the second is, of course, our Southern partnerships. We have rightly, over the last several years, focused a lot of attention on our Eastern partners. That's good, and we can't forget the South. And there we need to see deeper political and deeper practical engagement with our Southern partners. And it's only through that, through that kind of engagement politically and through that kind of practical engagement that we're going to actually be able to impact the ground or the environment in the South. And that's about giving NATO the right tools to be able to do that. So defense capacity building measures, mobile training teams, things of that nature ought to be part of what the alliance does going forward. Now, I'll give you an example, a specific example of where we could do better as an alliance. And again, it gets wonky and nerdy pretty quickly. But if you take a look at what we're trying to do in Jordan, for example, one of the things that the UK has done through voluntary national contributions is a mapping exercise that takes a look at where is NATO's value added? What are other nations doing? What are other international organizations doing? And where is it that the NATO can plug in its unique competitive or comparative advantage to the process of helping the Jordanians deal with the challenges they face, the security challenges they face, which bleed over into the alliance itself. That's something we should be able to do as a matter of course as an alliance. But it took a lot of time and a lot of back and forth to be able to get us there. And so as we move forward and we think about partnerships in the South, that's something that ought to be standard operating procedure for the alliance. And the last point I'll make, and then I'll stop, is we do see NATO-EU cooperation as critical to all of this. You're not going to be able to deal with the South without a strong, robust NATO-EU relationship. And I think that both Secretary General and High Representative Mogherini have done a tremendous job setting a tone at the top for being able to work together. But we need to move beyond, at some point, staff-to-staff conversations and into producing practical outcomes. And that's not just on the counterterrorism side or not just on the South, but it also applies to hybrid and cyber, which is where I began my remarks. I'll stop there because I don't want to go beyond the 3 minutes, but that's a lot to think about, and those are all things that we want to see: Iraq, Afghanistan, Southern partners, functional review, fit for purpose. That's what we'd like to see moving forward in the South and in the 360 going into the summit.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to the Atlantic Council, to Magnus for this invitation and for the action that you and the dynamism that you are injecting into NATO, into the Atlantic Alliance, and so that it's much needed, particularly now. I will start from the 360-degree approach. And we're talking about the southern dimension, the southern flank. And I would like to see that we are going to consider this 360 approach not as two slices of 180 degree and disconnected. this would be useful also to reinforce the unity and the solidarity among the allies. I mean that when we were discussing this morning, that at the end of the story, when we look at the challenges and the threats that we are facing in the southern dimension, in the southern flank as well, and to the east, of course they are coming to us in a different manner. But at a certain moment, I see that when we are trying to contain Russia in the east, I found Russia in Libya, I found Russia in Egypt, I found the Russian submarines in the Mediterranean. So I think that now it's time for NATO to be even more vigilant in the Mediterranean. And this is true also when we look that we have also other big competitors present and coming and stepping up in the African continent. I refer to China and I refer to future challenges that we have to address today in order to take action today and not to react tomorrow, maybe in the search of the right tools and instruments. And of course, NATO is already there. We have the Operation Sea Guardian, we have the Operation in the Agency, we have many tools that are deployed, and the next summit will set up once again the NATO training mission in Iraq. I remember when I was there with my Carabinieri in the designing and finding the places and in doing the things, and unfortunately now we have to go back in a situation that is worse in respect to the past, because now we have to counter, it's not only a training, but we have also to look to counterterrorism and to other major threats. But I think that NATO can do more in the Mediterranean, not only in making more effective the training tool that NATO has developed in all these years, from the first training missions to the next one. And here there is a discussion on the model, on the way in which these training teams must be set up, if by civilian experts or on a national basis, a multinational basis, or with some headquarters that are going to train on a rotational basis or not. So here is one of the thing. Another one is that we need to focus, finally, to focus in a serious way on when we're talking about the partnership, how to address the partnerships in the Mediterranean. Because here, once again, it's better to have a partnership of a bilateral way, on a multilateral way, or to have partnership also to reinforce the partnership with the Arab League, with some international organization. And this, we don't have the time, has consequence in terms of the outcomes that we can have, and particularly in the cooperation that we can have at the South-South level. But looking to the cooperation and to the action in the Mediterranean, the second point that you was already mentioned is the NATO-EU cooperation. Because most of the threats and challenges that are coming from this area are challenges that are finding a breeding ground from challenges that are of political, economic, and social origin. And here, the cooperation that we were able to have in recent times with the EU, and particularly I want to refer to the military mobility, where there is a concrete action from the EU side, I think that should guide us for the next steps that we have to tackle, and also look into how to reinforce in the present times the relationship between the two sides of the Atlantic, I mean the transatlantic bond. In conclusion, if I can add an other element, I would say that 360 degrees is not enough. We need 1 degree more of action. That it's in terms of communication, strategic communication to our public opinion, to the civil society. And in order to be closer to the security, I don't want to say needs here, I would like to say the security perceptions, the different security perception that we have maybe in the south instead has in the Baltic. So we need to merge these and to have a NATO that is able to communicate the right narrative, and of course with action. And I think that the next summit could be a springboard, particularly to the narrative that we have to elaborate, looking to the 70th anniversary that we are going to have next year.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Great that all of you stuck around for this final panel. I think NATO has done quite well since the watershed year 2014 in rebuilding and relearning deterrence, but it hasn't been doing quite as well in tackling the threats from the south and indeed on its periphery more generally. And of course, the threats are well known: the failing states, ungoverned spaces, which are giving rise to terrorism, instability, mass migration, directly affecting European security and global security. Of course, there was a lot of fanfare at the Warsaw Summit 2 years ago about our supposedly more aggressive agenda in this area. We came up with a new name, Projecting Stability. But in fact, we promised a lot, but so far have not delivered all that much. Allies have been unwilling to contribute substantial resources. And indeed, I think part of the problem is that allies are not really sure what NATO's role should be. And that even applies to the southern allies who say we need equal attention to the south, but then are not so clear as to where NATO fits in. Some even question whether NATO has any role at all in the Middle East. So I would argue it is important that NATO play its part. Not that it's going to be the main actor in many cases, but it's an important supporting player. The threats are real. Other actors, including Russia, are getting active along the southern periphery. But I think the reason for a robust southern agenda is largely political. It's important to maintaining solidarity within the alliance that we be able to show our publics in all 29 member states that NATO is addressing the threats of greatest concern to those publics. Now on terrorism, President Trump wants NATO to do more on terrorism, but NATO is, I think, at best only going to play an indirect role. Most of the allies are contributing to the counter-ISIS coalition, but it was actually the U.S. choice to pursue that mission outside the alliance and do it as a coalition of the willing. And it's working. There's no requirement to put it under NATO command. But I think what that means is that when it comes to counterterrorism and dealing with the threats and the instability along our southern frontier, where NATO can do best is using its partnership tools in a kind of preventive strategy, helping partners equip themselves more effectively to deal with threats in their own neighborhood, addressing the root causes of instability and terrorism, using tools like defense capacity building, training and exercising with partner forces, greater regional engagement to help partners better tackle the threats in their own neighborhood. We can do more in terms of intelligence sharing, both within the alliance and with partners, to help anticipate threats and ensure that we can kind of preempt them politically before they require military solutions. And we can look for ways to complement other institutions, starting with the European Union. I agree with Fabrizio that there's a lot of greater scope than we're exploiting now for NATO-EU collaboration. And the example in Europe of this military mobility indeed could be a good example for coming up with a kind of division of labor or a mutually reinforcing strategy, given that NATO and the EU have different but complementary toolkits to help promote greater stability along the Mediterranean and in the broader Middle East and North Africa. So Mike has previewed some of the decisions coming out of the Brussels Summit next month. It sounds like we'll be taking some important steps forward, but it won't necessarily be a step change in NATO's engagement. But still, I'm glad to hear that this Iraq training mission is coming together. Because we thought in 2016 we were launching an Iraq training mission, but it only ended up having about 24 trainers. So this time will be different. I think it's supposed to have 500 or 600 military trainers. Can have much more of an impact. And it may also be helpful to the new Iraqi government indirectly in helping them manage sectarian tendencies, can help them perhaps to curb Iranian influence. So having a NATO presence in country, I think, could have some political benefits beyond the training itself. I understand we're going to be stepping up defense capacity building with Tunisia to go along with what we've already been doing with Jordan and other key partners. That's good news, as are the mobile training teams. I hope we're not ruling out the possibility, in light of the recent French efforts to broker some kind of internal compromise in Libya, to follow through on NATO's earlier offer to help the Libyans create defense institutions and integrate all the disparate militias into a more unified national military. Last thing I think we need to think about is making better use of institutional partnerships. We've had the Mediterranean Dialogue and the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative for some years. The Mediterranean Dialogue goes back to the 90s, but they haven't really gelled into effective institutional frameworks that our partners feel serve their interests. So we should try to revitalize the ones we have, but also think about whether changes in the region, particularly the seeming demise of the Gulf Cooperation Council and the establishment of a new Saudi Emirati council, could be an opportunity for sort of stepped up NATO engagement in the Gulf without abandoning what we've been doing over the years with Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain. Finally, I just add briefly that this projecting stability agenda is not just about the South. It's supposed to be about the East, partners like Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, who are threatened by Russia, who have chunks of their territory occupied by Russia. NATO needs to do more to support their sovereignty, help them strengthen their resilience against hybrid threats and cyber attacks. I was encouraged to hear in the earlier panel that there may be a solution to the problem created by Hungary preventing the holding of a NATO-Ukraine Commission meeting at the summit level, that there may be some new format involving Georgia and Ukraine and the NATO members looking at the Black Sea security issues. But we definitely need to make clear to the Russians that we stand by these countries and we're not going to allow them to fall into a Russian sphere of influence. And very last point is we shouldn't forget some of the farther flung partners. We have, of course, partnerships with Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. Soon Colombia may join the ranks of NATO partners. Mongolia's a partner contributing a lot. As we deal with a rising China, NATO has to broaden its sights and think of where it could contribute, maybe indirectly through support for our democratic partners in the Asia-Pacific region, to managing an increasingly aggressive and revisionist China. I'll stop there.
Thanks. Well, look, there's a lot to build on there, so I'll try and keep this brief, but highlight a couple of areas where I think there's a lot of agreement on this panel, although maybe we can surface some disagreement in the conversation later, because that's always fun. I think, as Mike rightly noted, that NATO and sort of Western Europe and the U.S. really started to wake up to some of the asymmetric and hybrid threats that are being posed to NATO and its surroundings in around 2014 and then on. But there has been a lot of strong warnings coming from NATO allies further east for quite some time. And while I think that there has definitely been this much greater awareness across the alliance of the seriousness of these threats and the need to really take them on in a meaningful way, we do still have differing threat perceptions across the alliance that I think continue to pose a challenge to mobilizing the kind of real central and high-level political support and action alongside actual meaningful implementation that is necessary to tackle these effectively. In addition to obviously having some differing threat perceptions about Russia across the alliance, there is a differing threat perception in terms of the weight to attach to asymmetric and hybrid threats versus conventional threats versus strategic threats. I think it's really important that we understand these not as mutually exclusive or zero-sum equations, but that we need to look at these really holistically and understand the role that each of them plays in the threat equation in different ways across the alliance space. I think it's also really important to understand that, just as cyber has been really elevated on the agenda over time, that many of these tools, in fact, are not, don't manifest as physical attacks. There was obviously a lot of focus around, Ukraine in the little green men hybrid space, but a lot of the asymmetric attacks are aimed at our institutions and aimed at our democracies and are attacking our countries and the underpillars from that side without actually having to fire shots. And so really being able to grapple with these threats, I think, is something that has taken some time to mobilize political will. I think that's still a work in progress. I think a lot of the work that has been done to establish centers of excellence, both within NATO as well as some NATO European partnership organizations, centers that are looking at these issues, is a really important piece. I'm heartened to hear some of what Mike was saying in terms of establishing some teams to look at these issues. But for me, the structural point that Mike was making, which I think is so critical, is really essential on this. And it's something that I think is not just something that NATO is grappling with. I think a lot of our national governments aren't necessarily structured right to deal with some of these challenges. And so you look at the challenges at the national level, and then you take it to the level of 29, and you're just really compounding a problem that is throughout. But what I do think is actually you can almost invert the problem in a really meaningful way, which is that, as we've seen on some other issues, when you have a real focus at the NATO level on a particular issue, it can actually help mobilize political will within member state countries, within member state governments, by tapping into different ministries, by bringing them together, forcing collaboration and cooperation internally, and forcing progress. And I think that that's an important function. I completely agree on the importance of EU-NATO cooperation in this area. The EU's been doing a lot of work on these issues. It's also a little bit diffused throughout EU institutions and not in a super centralized way. But I do think the more that can be done in a cooperative way, bringing those two together is important. The private sector has a really important role on many of these issues as well, and figuring out ways of collaboration and cooperation there, bringing them into the conversation. There's some interesting discussions that actually happened at the G7 around these issues. It got lost in all the other headlines about what happened at the G7, but there were actually some decisions taken by the G7 countries for cooperation on intel sharing along the lines of what others were mentioning on these threats. Around cooperation with private sector, with internet service providers, and with social media companies. I think there will be some devil in details on how that's implemented, but I think there's some interesting models there for NATO to potentially look at as we're looking at how to better cooperate and harness our ability to really take on these threats. And then I think that it's also really important, on the point that was raised about having a really clear strategic communication strategy around these issues, because one of the things when we think about the disinformation problem specifically is one aspect of this issue. One of the things we know is most effective in countering that is by having a very strong affirmative message, so as not to allow there to be a void for others to fill. And I think that's why it's so critical that on these sets of issues as well, that there's a really strong message coming out of the NATO summit that these are a suite of issues that NATO sees as a very direct threat to the alliance, and that there is a unified approach and unified consensus really around tackling them together. So I really am hoping to see that as well.
Great, thank you very much. I have a lot of questions, but I think I want to start with counterterrorism. Mike, throughout the day we have heard that one of the things for this summit is an increase in the counterterrorism capabilities of NATO member nations. And I wanted to know, what does that actually look like? Can you name 2 or 3 things, each of the panel members, that need to be accomplished for counterterrorism capabilities to really be increased?
Well, part of it is a mindset issue. I think we have to embrace the strategic reality that terrorism is an enduring threat, that as we defeat the caliphate in places like Iraq and Syria, terrorism is going to remanifest itself in other places. You already see it happening in the Sahel. It's not new. And that this isn't going to be a problem that we solve in one place at one time and then get to go back to business as usual. So getting into that mindset and accepting that NATO has a role to play, not just saying it, but actually acting on it, is really important. And that is a much bigger hurdle, I think, for the alliance to get over, at least some countries within the alliance, than we sometimes appreciate. And then it's also remembering that solving this problem within the alliance, it's not just a big headline-grabbing set of changes. I mean, the mission in Iraq is a headline-grabbing change. If I go back to what I said earlier, The alliance is still built around a world that ended in terrorism in 2001, but in terms of what we're dealing with in the East, I would argue 2007, 2008. And we've adapted the command structure. That's a big change, an important change, but we haven't looked at how we work internally, how we structure our partnerships in the Mediterranean, how we structure the ICI, what we talk about, how often we talk about, what tools we put on the table. All those things have to be addressed. And that, I'll be honest, it doesn't grab the attention of presidents and chancellors and prime ministers. And quite frankly, I understand why. It's not a big political thing. But those little bricks, those little blocks, have got to be built. And it's not just about implementing a counterterrorism action plan. That's great. It's a good first start. But we got to make that step change in the way we think. It's not easy. On the NATO-EU front, we talked about this earlier. When the EU often comes to the United States and says, look, the world has changed. It's not black and white anymore. The EU has to get engaged in areas that like capabilities development or R&D and defense. And the alliance, need to understand that. And that argument is true. But it's also true that NATO has to do the same if we're going to deal with counterterrorism effectively, or hybrid effectively, or cyber effectively. So that argument applies on both sides of the ledger. And that means, as we Americans are told, you need to get over some of your old hang-ups. Okay, fair enough. But I think Europeans need to get over some of their own hang-ups about where NATO plays a role and how it plays a role. It's not a threat, it's a partner to the Union in the South. So those are the big things, that mindset change that is really important, that comes with these building blocks, these bricks I talked about at the opening of my statement.
Dr. Fabrizio, did you?
Oh, thank you. Terrorism will never end. It will change the skin. It will change the way in which it will threaten our societies. Yesterday was a different kind of terrorist. Today we have another kind. Tomorrow we will have the people that will try to bring us back, I don't know, because of ecologist reasons or other. It's a main issue for national government, we know this, but in my opinion there is still a room that we can exploit. It has been said by Ambassador Vershbow, particularly on the preventing, to anticipate, and to have intelligence sharing and so on. And in this field also the hub for the South can play a role in order not to give the situational awareness, but to have a situational understanding of what is going on in a dimension with which we are not so familiar. There is also, beside AWACS, the tools, there is also a role for NATO, in my opinion, in consequence management and in case of a terrorist attack. But there is, again, a room to exploit when we are talking about control and border security. We were talking about Tunisia. Border security is something that we can enhance, and we can train better partner countries. And this is particularly important in Tunisia, in Morocco, in countries like these, where we had experienced the major number of foreign fighters going up and down, and unfortunately many of them were not going back in these countries, but they are maybe mixed with migrants coming in Europe. And right now in Italy, our agencies are tracking around 200-300 people, and we don't want to say that they are all terrorists, but this is just a limited number regarding one country as Italy that has was able to manage a minor threat. But if we take into consideration, for instance, a country like France, where 2,000 foreign fighters were departing and 400 were coming back. So I think that this is a major threat for our nations.
Either of y'all like to comment, or can kick?
Just add a couple thoughts. I think it is a mindset issue, as Mike said. The allies are sort of coming around that NATO could be doing more in the area of terrorism, but it's still going to be a kind of a selective role. NATO isn't going to be able to be an all-purpose counterterrorism organization. I mean, there's a military dimension. We were fighting counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan before we shifted to a training role, and NATO is now part of the coalition against ISIS, so there are some kinetic activities, but for the most part NATO is on the margins on the military fight. And I would repeat what I said earlier, it's more NATO's ability to help partners address the conditions that give rise to terrorism, whether it's interdicting terrorists at their borders or helping them build better police and military institutions at home that they can kind of counter any spread of terrorism, nip it in the bud. But the biggest part of the fight against terrorism is the ideological one, and I think that's where NATO isn't going to be the lead actor. This is something more for each member state to deal with the social causes that lead to radicalization within their societies, to deal with the counter violent extremism information war, which NATO has not been a key player in. So NATO may be kind of a clearinghouse for best practices on these sorts of things, but inevitably the action will be elsewhere. And we just have to accept that, but try to optimize what NATO can do and try to give some resources to those programs where it can make a difference.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. It's been well covered, but I just would sort of foot stomp that last point from Ambassador Vershbow about the role that NATO can play is a clearinghouse for best practices on these issues, because I do think that is an area where it can really play a role on this.
Okay. I also wanted to get to a couple of points that we heard in our previous panels. When Representative Mike Turner was speaking, he talked about the need that this might also need to be an American reassurance initiative, that it can't always be the U.S. being a major player to NATO and that's being seen as a protective umbrella for the member nations. But then you also heard the Lithuanian minister question whether or not this alliance with the U.S. can be counted upon, given changing rhetoric and maybe changing attitudes towards Russia. And so, Mike, again, I wanted to just start with you, since you have, as part of your responsibilities, having managed that U.S. relations to NATO, how much do you hear from nations that they're concerned about maybe a changing attitude towards Russia, or has the U.S. position remained consistent in your view?
Well, I'm going to answer this question two ways, and probably in the way you'd anticipate. First off, I think there is a general consensus within the alliance about the nature of the threat from Russia. And we have in place a policy as an alliance that we enunciated in Warsaw about balancing deterrence and defense with dialogue. And I think that's working. Is it true that Latvia views the problem differently than Portugal because of, I think someone said, where you sit depends on where you stand? I think that is true. But is it also true that we all are in this together and we've embraced, as a collective, Latvia has embraced Portugal's security concerns and taken on an obligation to address them, and Portugal has embraced Latvia's security concerns and taken on an obligation to address them? I think that's true. And I think that allies recognize that. I would also argue that and someone made this, the minister made this point, the alliance is an incredibly resilient organization. I don't think we would have used that word in the past. That's a new word, it's a new buzzword, but it's true. And we have the capacity, because we have shared interests and shared values at the end of the day, and Tom talked about this, to recognize that as a collective, when we get together, we are laser-like focused on the challenges that we face. And I think that's continuing to happen. Is there a lot of noise outside the alliance about lots of other issues? Certainly, on both sides of the Atlantic. But the strength of the alliance is its ability to endure through that. This is not the first time we've experienced it, and it's I can remember as a student, this is a long time ago, that when I was studying international affairs and U.S.-European relations, the fights over, during the Reagan era about what constituted deterrence and dual track versus. I'm not sure it's all that different right now. We just think we're living through it for the first time. Maybe the lesson is we need to read a bit more history to learn that we've lived through it, we've endured, and we've prospered. And as long as we stay true to those values and stay true to those commitments, we'll be fine. And I think that is happening.
Okay. Would anyone else like to join in on that?
I would just have 2 points on this. One, for me, the clearest demonstration of an American reassurance initiative was NATO invoking Article 5 after 9/11. I think we saw pretty clearly a unified response to a very direct attack on America. And that, I think, was a very, very strong indication there, and I think that commitment has continued on through. So for me, I feel like we've kind of got what we need there. I mean, obviously, I understand the sentiment behind that we all need to be, as we have talked significantly about, sharing the burden in meaningful ways, but that's kind of how I see that. I will be a little bit more pessimistic on the question of the perceptions of American views possibly shifting on Russia. I think there are a lot of clear indications from Congress, from the national security community across the U.S. that there is still a very, very clear sense of the threat that Russia poses. But for the strategic messaging purposes that we were talking about earlier, I do think that it is harmful for that kind of unified, for mobilizing the unified threat perception that we really do need when we have discordant messages coming from the top.
Sure. Thank you. We can start audience questions. If there's anyone with a question, if not, I have many more.
Hi, Alex Sanchez. I'm an analyst here in DC. I have a question about U.S.-Moldova relations, since that was mentioned very briefly. What do you think is going to be the future of U.S.-Moldova and NATO-Moldova relations? NATO opened a liaison office in Moldova last year. Moldovan armed forces participated in the rapid Trident exercises in Ukraine last year as well. The U.S. military has a base in Moldova as well. So what does NATO and the U.S. expect out of Moldova, given its situation with the Transnistria issue and the Russian forces in the country? Thank you.
You want to start from the official perspective?
Go ahead. I feel like I'm getting all the questions. That's not really fair.
Well, I'm not too up to speed on U.S. Moldova relations, but I think NATO has been trying to help Moldova since 2014 with the defense capacity building program. Moldova was one of the first recipients of that. And of course, there's internal differences within Moldova on just how close a relationship to have with NATO, but I think NATO is prepared to continue to move forward and help Moldova, which has pretty rudimentary military capabilities right now, to develop at least a baseline force and to reform its institutions. And I think there's opportunities to support Moldova politically in shoring up its sovereignty, encouraging its closer cooperation with Ukraine and Georgia. There's a new initiative that's taking root of the speakers of the three parliaments meeting on a more regular basis, and I think that's a good way for Moldova to kind of assert its independence and sovereignty. And that's something that I hope I think the U.S. administration is supporting as well. But I don't have much more to say. Maybe Mike knows more about the bilateral.
I'll just foot stomp. There's a phrase I'm not used to, foot stomping, but it's one that I've heard a lot over the last few months. I know I have boots on and I'm not foot stomping. But the only thing I'd add is that I think the depth of the relationship between Moldova and NATO is in part contingent upon how deep of a relationship Moldova wants with the alliance. The alliance has a partnership. It is open to deeper cooperation with all of its partners. And the challenge, if I can put it that way, for Moldova is to take as full advantage of those opportunities as exist through mechanisms that are already in place.
Hi there, Michael Stetcher from the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. To what extent do you expect NATO to expand its remit into non-traditional security areas at the Brussels Summit in places like energy security or countering corruption?
Countering?
Yeah, I don't see NATO as a counter-corruption organization. I don't think that's its role. I think in as much as corruption is a hybrid threat, there is an important part of the conversation that needs to take place within the alliance about the nature of hybrid threats. I mean, we tend to think of them as, not understandably in the United States, because it's what's on the front pages, is it's all about election interference, which is true. But it also involves corruption. It also involves, the buying up strategic assets. It involves energy security. All those things are part of the hybrid challenge. And as a general proposition, the alliance, and Sandy talked about this a bit, as a clearinghouse for best practices, we need to be talking about that more. If for no other reason, that if we don't talk about it more, we're not connecting all of these dots. Right. I think the observation Lauren made that we're not necessarily as well organized, whether it's in the United States or in any other member states, to deal with this challenge it's 100% right. So more conversation is critical.
Yeah, on corruption, NATO has one small but I think important piece of the action, which is a program called Building Integrity, which helps partners develop clean defense procurement and acquisition systems and kind of root out corruption within defense ministries. And that has been apparently very effective. The U.S. has been a big supporter of that. On energy security, this is one of the issues that's supposed to be dealt with by NATO's Emerging Security Challenges Division, which was established, I guess, about 10 years ago. And it's actually useful more for raising the consciousness of allies. There's frequent briefings. They have meetings with the EU Energy Commissioner and experts from the International Energy Agency. So they got high-powered briefers, and allies, I think, report back, and it helps shape both national and EU policy by having these discussions at NATO and understanding the security implications. But it doesn't lead to any operational role for NATO. But it's still useful.
Yeah, I would just add that I think, as Ambassador Verschwell and Mike have sort of both suggested, that the operational role itself may be limited, but that doesn't mean there isn't a significant role that can be played in terms of information sharing, in terms of providing a forum to understand the integration of these threats with one another, right? That they do all relate, they do all underpin each other as part of a broader hybrid toolkit, asymmetric toolkit that's being used as a weapon against NATO and member states, and ensuring that, I mean, frankly, there are, again, some of these centers of excellence, for example, that have been set up that are doing some really good work studying the issues that is then shared with the member states as well. And I would just urge that I do think there is a political level role, within NATO to underscore that these challenges are ones that need to be understood as security challenges, even if at an operational level they are not ones on which NATO is the actual sort of leading edge.
And our sponsors, the Lithuanians, are the hosts of the Energy Security Center of Excellence, one of the early NATO centers of excellence.
Absolutely.
Well, given all of your areas of expertise, I'd be remiss if I didn't use our last question to ask about NATO's southern neighbors and the potential security threats posed there and the challenges. And I would like to wrap up with all of you thinking about worst case scenario 5 to 10 years from now. If actions aren't taken today, what is the threat to NATO? And given that, what is the priority for what should be done within the organization to keep this security threat in check?
Well, I don't think you can limit it to southern partners. Look, I think we are in a new strategic environment. We have been for a while. We've been, I don't want to say we've been slow to wake up to it. We've said the right things, but our implementation of policies and processes and deterrence and defense initiatives needs to catch up with our rhetoric. And I think Russia is an enduring challenge. I think that's very clear from the national security strategy. I think that is generally accepted across the alliance. And I think the threat from terrorism is enduring, and that's going to require adaptation. That's what we're doing right now. We're doing all that right now. We don't call it that, but that's in essence what we're doing. And the greatest threat is that we stop doing it. I think that's it depends on us to continue to make these changes.
Absolutely, Julie.
I would like to go back once again to the 360-degree scenario. Take into consideration if something is going to happen in the Baltics, and at the same time you have a cyber attack somewhere, and somebody maybe is pushing some migrants in our countries in the south, and so you have discord and the public opinion raising problem of decision making, and not only on the decision making, but in the decision to take, if to react, and how in support and in solidarity to those countries maybe in the north that are under pressure, under attack. And maybe this is going to happen with some knots in our cables that are cut in the Mediterranean or somewhere else by some drones or things like that. This, in my opinion, is a scenario that will not happen, but we must be ready to address it, and in the proper time.
How do you get ready? And how ready are you right now? Yes, sir.
It's to me, up to me. I think that we still have to work a lot. We have the capabilities, but we have to pull them together. And once again, it's not something that can be addressed only by one international organization alone, and it must be made in a more coordinated and coherent manner. But we are anyway the most powerful alliance and advanced economy in the planet, and I think that we can do something better than what we are doing today.
I mean, one can construct all kinds of nightmare scenarios, 5-10 years down the road of ungoverned spaces like Libya, kind of spreading across North Africa with terrorists, or not just using bombs and IEDs, but using cyber weapons, using drones, using ballistic missiles to threaten shipping, to threaten our homelands. So we need to get out in front of these problems. The terrorist threat is going to continue to evolve and morph into even more lethal forms. So the more we're proactive, and that's partly about NATO, partly about our nations individually, it's partly about the EU. We need to think ahead of how we can prevent these threats from taking root, because just terrorists equipped with advanced technology is for me, that's one of the biggest nightmare scenarios. At the same time, if we're sort of in exactly the same place with Russia still occupying eastern Ukraine and Crimea 5-10 years from now, I think that's going to lead to very unstable relations in Europe. I don't think the status quo is going to be a peaceful status quo. And so we have to think proactively, how can we create more pressure on Russia, as well as more incentives for Russia to actually get out of eastern Ukraine and sort of step back from the brink where it's been since 2014.
So I completely agree with Ambassador Berchwell on the sort of needing to understand what the future threats are before they are on our doorstep. And in that category, I would actually go back to an earlier point that he raised, which is China. And I don't put this necessarily in the worst case scenario kind of bucket 5 to 10 years, but I actually really want to highlight this and pull it up just a little bit. And you spoke about it predominantly in the sense of what China's doing in the Asia-Pacific region and around its periphery. Indo-Pacific region, yes, that's where we are now. But I would also say China's doing a lot in Europe's own backyard. And not even really in the backyard. It's in Europe, and it's in NATO. And so whether it's through the 16+1 that is really trying to deepen relations in the Central and East, obviously through its Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of infrastructure coming in. While that's often looked at through the economic lens, there is an enormous amount of high tech that is coming in. There are an enormous amount of strategic linkages, whether that's roads and railways and ports. And some of these are going to come right up around NATO's periphery, and on the infrastructure side, on the high-tech side, are actually going to be coming within NATO. And understanding, and frankly already are, understanding the implications of that to cybersecurity, information security. China's investing heavily in AI, in data acquisition. These are the kinds of things that I think really deserve some real attention before they are threats that are beyond something we can catch up to.
Thank you. I'd like to thank each of our panelists for being here today with us and ask if you have any final parting thoughts for us. And if not, just thank you very much for sharing your wisdom. And yes,
I was just going to, I didn't answer on the American Reassurance Initiative idea. I think right now after the G7 meeting, it probably wouldn't be a very popular initiative. But after tempers cool, Europeans should think about ways they could band together and show the U.S. through actions that they are shouldering more of the burden We had the slogan going into the Wales summit, 28 for 28, now it would be 29 for 29, that every ally find a way to contribute to the forces on the eastern flank, or make sure every single ally is doing its part in Afghanistan. And maybe thinking longer term, allies should think about key capabilities where the U.S. now provides either all or a disproportionate share of the capability, like airlift, air-to-air refueling, and come up with a European strategy to produce at least 50% of what NATO has in these key areas. That, I think, would cause even President Trump to stand up and take notice.
Now Sandy's, and I've got to say something, because there's something else we haven't talked about, and I think it's important. We have all of us on this stage, most of you in this room, operate under the assumption that our general publics understand the importance of the transatlantic relationship. I mean, I grew up in the Cold War. My frame of reference is different. Many of my bosses were, veterans of the early part of the Cold War or the tail end of World War II. We have societies today that don't remember any of this. They don't know what it is we went through, what we defeated, how we fought together, what our values were, and why they were important to us. And we all thought, I think, moving into the 21st century, that this would be solved by MTV, the internet, and CNN.
McDonald's.
And guess what? It wasn't. Those transatlantic routes need tending. Yes. And one of the things I think we all, and I'm speaking personally, one of the things we all need to invest in on both sides of the Atlantic are the kinds of public diplomacy, public affairs, people-to-people contacts that remind us why the Netherlands matters to the United States, why the United States is important to Germany, because it is not self-evident to our general publics. And I think the politics on both sides of the Atlantic underscore that. And I'm a deep, deep, deep Atlanticist, transatlanticist, and I think that's vitally important for the rising generation. We have to remind people what it is we're all about and why we are important together, standing together.
Well said.
On that note, thank you very much for speaking with us today, and great panel.
Mike, thank you. I think you did my job for me there on the outro. So no, I think that's absolutely right. And I think this conference has been quite toward the horizon, both on the challenges and opportunities facing NATO as it heads for the summit. So all that really remains are sort of the thank you. So thank you to our panelists and our speakers and our moderators. Thank you to the audience for participating, and to the Lithuanian MOD for their partnership, and also Defense News for the media partnership. I would encourage you to stay tuned. We'll have more programming coming related to the summit between now and then, and we'll also actually be at the summit on site for our NATO Engages event that we're doing in partnership with other think tanks. So thank you so much, and have a good evening.